It doesn't take an educated scholar to realize that we are in a tyrannical crisis, especially under the ruling class's new poster boy, Trump. But in order to understand how we got here, at the very least, let's go back a few decades.
The Obama administration bypassed public bidding and secretly gave the private prison giant Corrections Corporation of America, or CCA, a $1 billion contract to detain asylum seekers.
The reason why Obama was able to ravage our liberties and massacre thousands overseas with a secretive drone program is because the right didn't stand up to Bush when he kicked off the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and pushed the Patriot Act.
This new law that I signed today will allow surveillance of all communications used by terrorists, including emails, the internet, and cell phones. This bill met with overwhelming agreement in Congress. It will help law enforcement to identify, to dismantle, to disrupt, and to punish terrorists before they strike.
And to keep the blame balanced, the leftists didn't unite with the right-wingers who were warning that Obama was building a police state. The reason we got Biden is because we didn't stand up to Obama. And the reason we got Trump is because we didn't stand up to Biden. Trump is simply the ancestral offspring of Bush, Obama, and Biden's imperialist policies, and decades of our apathy to the dangers of capitalism.
Of the world's 85 richest people is equal to the 3.5 billion poorest people.
It's fantastic. And this is a great thing because it inspires everybody, gets the motivation to look up to the 1%. This is fantastic news, and of course I applaud it.
We built the throne that Trump now sits on, and the tyranny that we're seeing here is not foreign or new. It's simply being felt by those of us who didn't think it was as real as black people, Native Americans, and countless overseas victims have been trying to tell us how real it was. But now that we're waking up to the failures, how do we properly analyze this global police state? We're sitting down with Dr. William I. Robinson, who is an American sociologist and professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, specializing in political economy, globalization, and social theory. He's widely recognized for his work on global capitalism and transnational class formation. In the 1980s, Robinson worked directly with the Sandinista National Liberation Front, FSLN, in Nicaragua during the revolutionary period after they overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in 1979. He was involved in political education, journalism, and solidarity work, helping to support and defend the Sandinista revolution both inside Nicaragua and internationally. His experiences during that time deeply shaped his later academic work on imperialism, social movements, and the global capitalist system. Robinson remains an outspoken advocate for anti-imperialist movements and often draws from his Sandinista-era experiences and his critiques of U.S. foreign policy and neoliberalism. But more importantly, he's a great guy. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Thank you so much for having me on the program.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming out to my house. Not too often the interviewee comes to me. I usually have to go to them, so I can't complain. Can't complain about that.
Mark, thank you so much for that introduction. And I mean, I can't agree with you more that each of these different administrations have simply laid the groundwork for the next one to take over and continue and deepen these policies. And I would say that there's a flip side to war, intervention, and imperialism abroad. And the flip side, simultaneously, is war against the working class and the poor here in the United States. And they go together. And so Obama, and before him Bush, and before him Clinton, and so forth, all of them for the last half century have been waging war against the U.S. working class and the poor through neoliberal policies, from catering to capital, to Wall Street, to the banks, to the giant corporations here at home, and to whittling away at all the gains that poor people and workers made ever since the New Deal in the 1930s. And so you got these two things going on, exactly what you're pointing out, these endless imperialist wars abroad, and at the same time, endless attacks on workers and the poor here at home.
Absolutely, but yet we're still stuck in bipartisan bickering, as if there are Democrats up in Washington fighting for our civil liberties and the working class, and as if there are Republicans up there fighting for our sovereignty or conservative values. We are trapped in these two sheep pens. It's all one pen with a very thin veil dividing the two pens, but it's ultimately the people owning the pen still own the pen, and we're still under their power, no matter what side we choose.
Exactly. You know, and I think moving forward, at some point, there's a big debate on among the left and progressives right now with Trump, which, in my view, Trump is really a dangerous qualitative intensification of this enemy that we face. I mean, I really think, Trump really is ushering in fascism. So there's a lot of debate right now on the left whether, should we go back and support the Democratic Party against fascism? And I think personally, and of course everyone is debating this, that is a big mistake, because just as you pointed out, we have twiddle-dee-dee and twiddle-dee-dum. They're two different sides of the same, I'm just going to outright use the language. They're the same ruling class. They're the same political ruling class in control of the U.S. state, and they represent the interests of corporate capital, of the rich, of the billionaire class, of what I've been calling in my work the transnational capitalist class. And the vast majority of people in the United States, 80%, according to the data, 80% of people in the United States live paycheck to paycheck. 80% of the people in the United States don't have more than $400 in their bank account. You lose your job and you can't pay your rent or your mortgage the next month. So thing is, 80% or more of people in the United States are workers or poor, hard-working people, just getting by. And neither of these parties represent the interests of that vast majority, that working-class majority.
So how is it that they're able to psychologically convince Americans that there is a struggle for the American working class in the upper echelons of power, with no mind to their corporate handlers, their corporate masters? How are they able to constantly convince Americans that this is a struggle between good and evil forces up in Washington, and we're just not supporting those politicians hard enough? We're not voting hard enough.
Right. Yeah. That's a fantastic question. I mean, it's really important, and the answer requires some discussion here. But I think one thing is that, there's many different dimensions, but one thing is that we have this two-party system, and so when we get disgusted with Republicans, we go towards the Democrats. We get disgusted with the Democrats, we go towards the Republicans, and we don't have a third party, in terms of, at least in the electoral arena, we don't have a third party. The other thing is that, and this may be changing a little bit with social media and finding alternative sources of information. For instance, there's genocide going on against the Palestinians, and younger people know about the genocide as being live-streamed by Palestinians themselves, and young people see that. But the thing is, for all of these years and all of these decades, we've relied on the corporate media, and the corporate media doesn't give us an alternative view of the world and of politics and what's going on. They simply shift a little bit to the liberal Democratic side, or there's another coverage, they shift a little bit to the Republican, more right-wing side. So the vast majority of people are bombarded by this ideology and this worldview coming from the ruling class and from the corporate elite. That's another factor going on. The other thing is that, and to get into, I don't want to get so much into abstract theory, but, on the left, we study the concept of hegemony. Originally goes back to Antonio Gramsci, an early 20th century Italian communist and anti-fascist. But he came up with this concept of hegemony, in which vast majority of people adopt the worldview and the ways of thinking of the ruling groups. And unless something snaps and they get a radically different perspective on things, they tend to view the world from that hegemonic position of the rulers. So that's another thing going on. And then there's something else going on. We're all dependent for our very existence, literally, to get our food, our shelter, our clothing, all of our material needs. We're dependent on corporate capital, completely dependent for employment. And so that material dependency that we have on corporate capital and their control over the economy, the whole global economy, also gives them a certain, you can call it political and ideological power to control our thoughts. And then there's Hollywood. I know that you came to politics you were telling me, through opposition to the genocide right now against the Palestinians. Look at what comes out of Hollywood. I grew up, I learned in my late teens some different perspective, but people grow up looking at Hollywood, in which Arabs are presented as crazed terrorists, in which U.S. imperialist forces are fighting for freedom and democracy, the good guys fighting the bad guys. That's the ideology that that people swallow.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a lot of things going on, but I think another thing also is that we don't have a strong, we did in the several times, the 1920s and 1930s in the United States, again in the 1960s and early 1970s, we had alternative voices on the left, a strong left, a socialist, both socialist, anarchists, communists, radical black and Chicano liberation struggles. We had alternative ideologies which reached millions of people, but we haven't had that since the mid to late 1970s.
I'm glad you brought up Hollywood. It goes to show that the empire realized that in order to maintain its hard power, it also adapted and evolved around us and around our actions to know that it had to develop its cultural hegemony to protect its hard hegemony. And it's interesting you bring up Hollywood because they realized that the power of film, using emotion, using music, using an antagonist, a protagonist, making it very black and white and very, very unnuanced. The more that we learn about CIA's connection to Hollywood and the military-industrial complex's direct funding to Hollywood movies, the more we cannot unsee these, when we watch these old films, how the agenda behind it and how seductive it was. And I think that we're finally waking up to that, but so much damage has been done, just culturally and psychologically, that it has enforced the hard power, so that when we declare war on Iran, it's like, oh, well, in the back of your mind, you're thinking of Iranians and Iran as this aggressive, savage beast that's ruining all of the Middle East. When you start to take a step back and get outside the paradigm of the United States propaganda, you realize, holy shit, we're the aggressor. We're the savage beast that's ravaging the Middle East.
Right.
And so it goes to show that empire realized it had to wage a multi-front war to maintain its power, not just through hard power, but you got to co-opt.
Exactly.
You got to use liberalism.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, this is extremely important. I agree with you completely, and there are exactly those two different dimensions that always go together is the hard power, the actual coercive power of the capitalist state, and then there's the soft power of all of these cultural and ideological dimensions. I want to add something there, and it's that, and Hollywood plays its role in this, the mass media plays its role in this, is that if the ruling groups are going to be attacking a certain people, whether it's the Palestinians or the Iranians, or whether it's poor people and homeless people and workers in the United States, you have to dehumanize those people. Mm-hmm. You have to criminalize them. You have to make them look like the other, like they're somehow subhuman. You have to create the ideological, political, and cultural environment to be able to carry out this aggression. Again, whether it's the homeless and poor people here in the U.S., whether it's Iran and Palestinians. The other thing I want to mention, coming off of what you're saying, is that I want to go back to a situation in which the masses of people in the United States, the working class, which again is 80-90% of us, the working class has been socioeconomically destabilized, has been facing increasing social anxiety and insecurity over the future, because we have a very grim future if things continue as they are, and has been moving downward, experiencing not social mobility upward, but downward over the last 50 years of capitalist globalization. And so there's all of this mass discontent in the United States. Massive. The system is not seen as legitimate. And so the ruling groups, they have to take that discontent and make sure it's not channeled at the system, at the elite, at the ruling group. And so how do you do that? You misdirect or you redirect that discontent called scapegoats. So it can be Palestinians, it can be Arabs, it can be Iranians, or right now, immigrants. Yeah. You hear the discourse, immigrants, they're rapists, they're savages, they're bringing fentanyl into the United States, a complete dehumanization, and that's the scapegoat function, that you have to channel that discontent away from the system, which is the real source of our problems, and towards these scapegoated communities, and that's also where Hollywood movies come in, right?
Absolutely, and on those lines about immigrants, protest activism tends to try and appeal to Americans' morality about this. Like, oh, they're human beings, they're just families trying to survive. Unfortunately, in this country, that doesn't really work too much, especially on the right. They think in terms of what is good for me in my country. And I feel like that is where we could start learning as activists how we could use certain language that gets them to relate to this struggle not by appealing to their morality.
Yes.
Because we can reach people through that, don't get me wrong. And we do bring people over thanks to great moral voices who call out for that. But then you got the other part of Americans who simply are like, oh, I don't care. Like, they're foreigners. They don't belong here. And it's bad for my country. It's bad for my pocketbook. So then you have to use strategic language.
Right.
And that's what I want to talk
Well,
about.
you know, it's fantastic what you just said, because some of us on the left, again, I'm proudly a socialist. And what I mean, before I jump into a response to what you just put out there, let me just define what I understand socialism to be.
Yeah.
We have an economic system, right now it's global, it's worldwide, the capitalist system, in which all of our labor of all, you know, how many of us? There's 7, 8 billion of us now. All of our resources, all of it is organized in order to meet for private profit of the corporations. And socialism simply means the logic of the system, how we organize our collective labor and our resources is not for private profit, but for social need. Very simply, a switch over from what drives the system, the global economy is private profit, to what drives it is the social need of the vast majority of humanity. That's my understanding of socialism, and I'm proudly a socialist. But I want to get back to this because this is crucially important. Yes, the moral message, the call to be ethical and moral is very important. But what we really need to show the masses of working people in the United States, again, it's the working class is multi-ethnic, multiracial, multinational, right? The vast majority of us, we share a common interest in having a totally different socioeconomic system that meets our needs. That is the language of class, of saying to the people that say, I don't care about that, I'm not an immigrant, so I don't care, I'm not Palestinian, so I don't care. But we have to show those people, wait, beyond the moral issue, we have common interests. Hey, why are immigrants being attacked? Because their labor, they're the cheapest part of the working class, giving their labor to the economy. Work, sustaining agriculture, sustaining construction, sustaining the meatpacking industry and the poultry industry and so forth. And they're being attacked because the program coming from above, and you pointed this out, this goes all the way back to Obama, it's really to Clinton as a turning point, because that's neoliberalism. But the whole thing has been, how can you weaken the working class, whittle away at the gains the working class made from the New Deal from the 1930s, and how can you intensify exploitation? We have to speak on these issues of empire abroad. We have to show how they are linked to attacks against working people here in the United States. So the attacks against immigrants is simply the front line of the attack against all workers.
Yes.
I know I'm talking a lot, but let me elaborate.
You can talk as much as you want. We're at my house.
Okay.
I'm comfortable. I got my tea.
Okay.
I got my vape. I'm good to
and
go.
You can mix it around
I'm not in a rush
edit
anymore.
later. Yeah. But let's look at this. At one point, significant portions of the working class in the United States had stable employment year-long. You had vacations, you had overtime pay, 40-hour work week. If you had a job, you could expect to have it all year long. So that was something we struggled for, and not everyone got it. But post-World War II period, that was, major sectors of the working class. But since then, everyone is facing more and more what we call precariousness, precarious employment, precarious life circumstances. You have maybe part-time work, you have temporary work, you have unemployment, you have underemployment, you have absolutely miserable McJobs, minimum paying McJobs, even professionals. 70%, I'm a professor, I'm a university professor. I have tenured employment, so I'm stable. But 7 out of every 10 university classes in the United States are taught by adjunct professors, meaning you get a PhD. You're in debt. You're in debt 150,000 when you graduate.
At least.
You've gotten the highest degree possible. You want to now get a stable job as a professor, and yet the vast majority of hires now are what's called adjunct professors, meaning you're paid per class with no guarantee that the next semester you'll get another class, with no health insurance, no retirement benefits, no vacation pay. Between semesters, you're not paid. And so, believe it or not, the majority of PhD graduates now enter as adjunct professors and live below the poverty line, even if you teach all year long. But where I'm going with this is that the vast majority of workers in the United States are moving towards that precarious type of employment which is unsustainable, which is not a living circumstances in which you can have a decent life. And the attack on immigrants, which is how we got into this discussion, is really an effort to deepen that precarious type of employment arrangement in which we can be super exploited and thrown away when we're not needed for all workers. So the struggles of the immigrant sector of the working class is a mirror being held up to us and telling us all workers are moving towards that. That's what the capitalists want. They want all workers to be in that precarious circumstances that immigrant workers are in. Immigrant workers are vulnerable because they can be deported at any moment because they don't have legal status. And what the ruling class wants is that all workers are vulnerable all the time. Anyway, I know it's a little bit theoretical, a little bit abstract, but I think
we need abstraction.
We need it.
We need it.
But really, just to recap, the key story here, going back to how you introduced the topic, is yes, there's a moral story here. Absolutely, right? Absolutely. Whether we call our values socialist, anarchist, Christian, they're human values. Yes. But we need to show how we have common interests.
Exactly.
And we do have those common interests. And
going back to starting this, as far as the abstraction is concerned, we all know the biggest problem with Americans when it comes to socialism. It's scary. Scary word, just like communism. And I've been trying to brainstorm and workshop this, and I'm thinking like, okay, how do you get a population that literally did not drink Corona beers during COVID because it had the word Corona in it? How do you convince them that socialism and the performative effects it has is going to benefit them? And I've been trying to think of maybe we should introduce a new term and just put an American bow tie on it to feed it to them. I'm just thinking of how we can conquer this allergy that Americans have.
Sure. Yeah, and the allergy didn't come out of nowhere. Of course, the ruling class has slandered and tried to give socialism a bad name for ever since socialism came about in the late 1800s. And secondly, of course, the people that called themselves socialists, such as the Soviet Union and China, nothing to do with, real socialism, also gave it a bad name. But you're right, we can change the name. I think what's important is to use a language where we're showing, I mean, if we do want to use the term socialism, what does socialism mean? It means universal health care, free health care for everyone. It means universal free education for everyone. It means living wages, not minimum wages, living wages. It means stable employment. Like we have to say to people, not, ideologically, this is the ideological battles, this is hands-on what socialism means.
Yeah. And you can also potentially even do reverse psychology of saying, the system we have now is socialist, but it's socialist for the elites.
Exactly.
It's like we're already living in a socialist environment, but the thing is the beneficiaries are the top 1% billionaires. They get your tax money and they get to funnel that into weapons contracts, or development contracts, whatever the next product they're selling to the public, the next government, they're going to be getting that money. Wouldn't you, even if philosophically, let's say you're a 100% pure-hearted libertarian and you don't believe that public money should be going to the public or nobody should collect money from you. Okay, fair, but the fact of the matter is your money is being taken away from you, whether you like it or not. It's just not being given back to your fellow citizens around you. It's being given back to pedophile, sick, deranged billionaires who live in Fifth Avenue in a top-notch suite who are pulling the strings of war and death.
Yeah.
So who would you rather have your money that's getting taken from you anyways go to?
Exactly. We need to switch from corporate socialism to people's socialism, to working class socialism. Exactly. I mean, let's take the case of Musk, this shadow, president, which really sometimes it seems like he gives the orders to Trump. He and Peter Thiel and all of these tech billionaires. Musk gets billions and billions, maybe hundreds of billions at this point, directly from the U.S. government in order to become more and more of a multi-billionaire. His SpaceX is basically, we used to have, NASA used to be, public space exploration. Now it's all private and billions of profits. Skylink, Musk's company is Skylink. And Skylink controls all of these satellites, which feeds intelligence, and from being a former military guy, feeds intelligence to the Pentagon, feeds it to the Ukrainian forces on the ground. And so where does all that, how does he become a multi-billionaire? Through corporate socialism, through the state taking our taxpayers' money, which is working class wages. We work for our wages. We create wealth with our labor. And a portion of that wealth we create is taken as taxes. Doesn't come back to us as free universal health care, and it goes right to Musk and to the billionaires. So exactly, we have corporate socialism.
And after that is all explained, I would be bewildered by anybody who would then say, well, I still would rather that happen than go to the homeless guy down the street. I mean, the insanity of a person who, after you explained that just now, and still being okay with that system, it makes no logical sense. Even if you're 100% selfish and you don't care about people, you have no empathy for the homeless guy or the immigrant or whatever, to then be like, well, I kind of like it going to Elon Musk. It's like it's almost like the same mentality behind football. It's like they don't care about the effects it has on them as long as their team, their guy, is winning. They're vicariously living through the success of these billionaires who don't care about them and will not benefit them at all. Those are the only people that I can see who would be left as being okay with this system after you've explained it to them face to face just now.
If, of course, I don't know how many people will see this interview, but of course that's the other thing that's going on, is that the ruling groups that control the means of communication, if Trump or Musk want to give out a message, they go on television and instantly tens, hundreds of millions of people listen to them. I give a lecture in my classrooms, and I have maybe a group of 80 students. But I want to follow up on the point here. And one of the things the ruling groups has done is to divide us below, meaning again 90% of us, the multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-gendered, the multinational working class. What we all share is that we're just trying to work and get by, and we share the same social economic conditions, the same class. And we don't think in those terms, but there's a reason we don't think in terms of our own class consciousness and class connections, because the ruling groups have divided us, whether it's black, white, brown, Asian, whether it's along ethnic or racial lines, whether it's citizen workers or immigrant workers. Whatever it is, has completely divided us and has deliberately not used the language of class. So the reason I'm saying this is because right now you get workers who are swayed by the liberals, swayed by the Democrats, say, oh, all those people that voted for Trump, they're basket cases, they're terrible, whatever it is. But the fact is that all the people, the vast majority of people that voted for Trump, are poor white and Latino and non-white workers, right? And so the two groups face each other. The ones that vote for the Democrats are workers. The ones that vote for Trump and Republicans are workers. And they have so much in common. And I'm on the left. If I go to someone that voted for Trump and says they're on the right, and I say, well, you should be on the left, that doesn't get us anywhere. That's useless, that kind of language. But if I say to them, look, you and I both right now, we can't get decent, stable employment. You and I, both right now, we're having trouble. What are we going to do when we get older and we retire? And Social Security is under attack, and when Medicare is under attack. So we start using that language, and that's the language of class. Exactly. We can counter these attempts above to divide us. And there's a larger story here, and again, you can edit later, so you may not want to go into this direction.
I'm going to go into everything.
Okay. I have been condemning and criticizing what some people call identity politics, what I term I use the term, someone's used the term identitarianism, in which what is the language that we're all boxed into these different identities, black, Latino, white, gay, straight, all of them. And that language, it doesn't originally come from us below. It comes from the ruling groups.
Yeah.
It comes from the ruling groups that takes the language of class and erases it, and instead turns it towards the language of identity.
Yes.
And that's a serious problem blocking our solidarity of those that are all working and poor and facing an insecure future.
Well, this goes back to an episode that we had done about whiteness, how the term white is rather new concept. It wasn't a thing in medieval Europe, say, because in medieval Europe, racism was along the lines of Huguenots and the Irish, or Scots and the Brits, or the French and the Spaniards. It wasn't, but they realized that because there was such a multi-ethnic group of white people from varying parts of Europe came to Turtle Island, and now they had to figure out, okay, how can we categorize these people so that we can create more class divisions, to create buffer zones for the ruling class.
Right. Well, there's a hands-on history here. We have this all documented. I mean, in sociologism, we teach this. We don't have to invent any of this stuff. First, there was no concept of race prior to capitalism, prior to the 15 and 1600s. So this notion of black, of white, of Latino, these are socially created categories. In fact, biologically, we're all the same race. Mm-hmm. We're all Homo sapiens sapien. The notion that we belong to different biological races among human beings is completely 100% false. And that's not even debated among scientists, social and natural scientists. So what happens is, when the European rulers, the early rulers of Europe, not the poor light-skinned people who are farmers losing their land, peasants, serfs losing their land in Europe, not them, the rulers conquer the Americas in order to plunder the wealth. Then slave the indigenous, but most of them die off very quickly. By this late 1600s, there's not many indigenous people left to exploit. And so you begin to import two other groups: indentured servants, which is just another fancy name for slaves, from Europe, and there's millions of them.
Mostly Irish, correct?
No, from all over Europe, English, French, wherever they come from.
Right.
Yeah, indentured, meaning that they were serfs on the land. They got kicked off their land. They became immiserated, and they had to literally sell themselves and say, sure, I'll go to the New World. I have no choice to pay my debts. It's very, very often forced. It's just another word for slavery, and this is all documented. I mean, this is not something unknown. So you had light-skinned slaves, and you had African slaves working on plantations, well, here in the United States, of course, in the Carolinas and Virginia, but also in the Caribbean. And they didn't identify amongst themselves as white and as black. Those terms didn't even exist at that point. And there were uprisings by these indentured groups in the Caribbean, and what is today Barbados, and what is today Jamaica, and also in what's the Virginia and the Carolinas today. And it was really not until the 1600s, with quite a number of uprisings and rebellions among these different groups, and with identifying with each other, that the ruling group said, okay, we got a problem here. We've got to divide these people. We're going to invent the concept of race, and we're going to enslave a certain segment. And in fact, in the Caribbean is where this really started, where the ruling groups, the planter class, with the ruling political elites back in England on their colonies in the Caribbean said, okay, the Africans, they're going to be black, and they have to do the manual labor in the fields. The indentured servants, which are light-skins, which have been doing that manual labor, are going to be the supervisors and slightly higher up. And so that's the role of racism. Racism is invented by capitalism in the 15 and the 1600s as a way of dividing and controlling the masses of exploited people. And so racism has always had a double function. First of all, you're going to be able to super exploit and super control one group among the exploited. Whether it's blacks, whether it's Chicanos here in the Southwest, whether it's immigrant workers today in the 21st century, that's the one function of racism. Take the working masses, separate and super exploit one group. The other function of racism has always been divide and rule. Divide the working class. Have them see that they're fighting against each other and not against the rulers.
Those dynamics that took place, started hundreds of years ago. explain how it's just as active today as it was then, albeit in a different form, with different language, and maybe with even subtle hints of liberalism to make it more digestible for Americans to accept these same divisions.
Right. Well, the clearest example we have right now, I'll use the language of racism, but the more general thing is how the ruling groups create division among the working masses. But the clearest example we have in 2025 is this war against immigrants. That there are citizen workers, and then of course you use patriotism, the language of patriotism, and you tell those that are citizens that the threat, who's taking their jobs, who's the criminals, where is the threat coming from? From immigrant workers. So that's the clearest example of this divide and rule strategy today. Historically, it's taken different forms. But I mean, that's so crystal clear. What is going on right now is how immigrants are turned into this super exploited and super controlled sector that becomes the scapegoat.
Yeah.
The thing is, that's the ruling class strategy, Trump's strategy. In part, it's effective. For instance, some of the trade unions, the head of the United Auto Workers, for instance, not the workers necessarily, but the head, is in agreement with this war on immigrants, saying, yeah, so U.S. citizens can get jobs. But the thing is, it's not necessarily effective, because at the same time, what is Trump doing? They're threatening to undermine Social Security. Mm-hmm. They're threatening to dismantle all of these different social programs. So that's today's example of what's historically been racism, using racism to divide the working masses. Today's example really is anti-immigrant, but also anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, Islamophobia. Mm-hmm. And these are the different mechanisms to divide and rule, to confuse people as to who is the enemy, where is my insecurity coming from, why do I have an insecure future, who's threatening it?
And for the longest time, in recent memory, it was the high taxes we pay, as opposed to educating people that a large chunk of your taxes is going to the Pentagon to fund wars.
Exactly.
They would redirect, like you said, and the term, when you talked about redirecting the focus away from the elites, I was trying to come up with a term that describes that, and the best I came up with was social judo. Because in judo, what you do is, when you feel people are angry about something, what you do is you take the momentum, that revolutionary spirit that's building up within society, and then you redirect the momentum away from you.
Exactly.
And they would say that, oh, well, it's because you have a bunch of black people on welfare. Look at these lazy black people. Look at these immigrants who are living off the system. And this was the language that I remember hearing. I think it was during the Obama administration. You had a lot of pundits on right-wing media saying this, and then Obama then marketing himself to black people as being the savior of black people because he's black. And it was this ballet between the liberals and the conservatives, all to redirect our focus away from the military-industrial complex in Afghanistan and Iraq. So sorry to interrupt. No, go.
Right, to redirect our focus away from the military, Afghanistan, Iraq, the empire abroad, but also to redirect our attention to the other thing that was going on with Obama. He simply was an agent for Wall Street and the giant global banks and corporations at the same time.
Yeah, and then so they provided the savior to Obama. So you always have to, you use up you use a president who has charisma, and again, they're just actors at the end of the day. It's just like auditioning for a role. It's like, okay, well, right now we really need a Bush, because a Bush is the solution to the boogeyman, the Arabs who are attacking us, and the terrorists out there. Okay, so we need a Texan. We need a get it done Texan. Okay, so now Bush's charisma has been dried up. So now we need a new face that counters Bush. You need Obama, young, handsome, eloquent black man who appears to be the voice of change that we can believe in, hope and change. So they give us Obama. And then he simply enforces what Bush did, but with just a different flavor that gives us the sense that, we feel nice, warm, and cozy. And so this ballet is so obvious now. And then, of course, Trump was the response to Obama.
Exactly.
Oh, we need to stop this wokeness of taking care of, immigrants and black people, even though Obama never did that. He deported more, and he was terrible for the black community, of course. And so Trump is the solution to that. And then you have Biden, and then you have Trump again. So it's this ballet that they do to keep us on this string of the pendulum, And
Couldn't agree more. I mean, that's fun. Everything you laid out, I agree 100%, and that's exactly what's going on. I would just add one thing.
Yeah.
Because we really need to use the language of class. And why does that sound so bad? Because the ruling groups have said do not use class. The ruling groups have made class a curse word.
Yes.
And capital a curse word. The reason I'm saying that is you said that Obama was bad for the black community. But he was good for black elites, black middle class, and professional. Okay. And he's bad for the mass of black workers.
Yeah.
But he never used the language of black workers are being exploited, right? Intentionally, of course, because that's the curse word you can't use.
Because the worker, you don't want to use the word worker.
And you don't, right. And you want to cover up the fact that Obama's policies, just like all of them, are immiserating the black workers. The black workers, which is 80-90% of blacks.
Yeah.
But those same policies, the woke policies, all of that, were lifting up 10-20% of black and Latinos into the professional class and the elites.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's so that's also why you get. There's another impediment. Sure, it's capital and it's the ruling class, and there are two parties which they control, which are constantly dividing us and figuring out new ideological and political ways of keeping us down and stopping us from uniting. But it is also this middle and professional strata, these intellectuals, these professionals within the black and the Latino and the white communities, which also play their role in the identitarian paradigm, in these identity politics.
And getting back to identitarianism. Identitarianism, am I saying that right? Identitarianism. I'm learning so many new terms in this past year and getting in this space, but I love it. It's like every person I talk to live, I'm learning these new terms. So I don't mind looking stupid. But the identitarianism, I was talking to Chris and Josh, and by the way, I want to give them a shout out because if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have met you. They have helped me refine my views and my philosophy, and they've been guiding me on a really good path, And identity, Chris said something to me that no doubt he learned from you, was that identity has become overblown when it comes to in revolutionary spaces. Not that identity is not valuable. I mean, we all have identity, and it's the flavor of humanity. We all have different languages and foods and cultures, but the problem is that when we exacerbate that concept in our minds and in our communities to the point where it creates these walls that prevent us from reaching out and locking arms, and what it basically boils down to is that the only identity that's functional right now that we need to be concerned about is that we're fucking poor.
Exactly.
You're poor.
Right.
You might be a Muslim, and then you might have a beautiful Muslim community to go to and worship and have food and all that, but you're fucking poor. If you might be a Christian, and you might have a church that you go to and a great, beautiful community to go to and study the Bible and be in a spiritual space with them, but you're fucking poor. You might be Jewish, and you might have a lot of some beautiful traditions you might engage in, and you might have your fellowship in your synagogue might be great, and you might even have some wealthy business owners who you're friends with, but you're fucking poor. Unless you're a billionaire, you're fucking poor. Because at the end of the day, when the police kick that door down, it doesn't matter. Unless you're a billionaire who can bribe the politicians who passed the policy that got you arrested, you're fucking poor. So until we grasp that concept and stop looking at ourselves in tears.
Couldn't agree more. And to follow up on this, the impression that many people would have by listening...
Ezra, you don't have to crawl, buddy. you're not on camera.
Oh, is this your son?
This is my son, Ezra, yeah.
Hi, buddy.
This is
What's
Dr.
your name,
William Robinson. Yeah. He's been quiet in his room watching TV.
Hey, buddy, I didn't even know you were here. How old are you?
7.
7? Oh. What are you watching on TV?
YouTube.
YouTube? Yeah. You pick whatever you want on YouTube.
This is the first time him seeing Daddy work in a camera interview. So
I've seen these before.
You've seen this before? Yeah.
Yeah, like each camera, it's a line, and then you guys.
Yep. This is the magic. This is what it looks like behind the magic. Your YouTube videos.
It's blurry. It's like blurry behind you guys.
Yep. It's called the bokeh effect. Bokeh effect. Well, you can do whatever you want, man. We're just we'll be doing our thing over here. All right.
Hang on. I lost the train of thought there.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I got to remember it. Wait.
Well, about what along the lines.
Yeah,
of
the identity and poor.
thing.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So let me just pick up here what I want to say. So, the language we hear, one from the ruling class, the ruling groups, but also I want to go back to these fake progressives, this fake left, this identitarian left, these professional, we call them sometimes professional managerial elite, the woke elite. What they tell us, for instance, you would never know from what they tell us, the majority of poor people in the United States are white. The absolute number. Numerically, there's more poor white people than there are black and Latino poor white people.
Right.
And increasingly, poor white people are just as much, are mass incarcerated along with black and Latino people. And if you go to a prison, you have whites, you have black, you have Latino, you have some other groups. Okay. And they're fighting amongst others. And we know that the guards make them fight amongst each other.
Yep.
But here's the thing. What do they all share in common? They all come from the poorest, lowest rungs of the working class. And from surplus labor, people that have been structurally unemployed their whole lives. Okay. But they don't think in those terms because from above, they've already been divided according to these different identities. The majority, the absolute American majority of people who are food insecure and hungry in the United States are white. Now, all of this is not to say, therefore, that white people are suffering more or should be against black and Latino people that are hungry or that are homeless or that are underemployed or unemployed. But on the contrary, what do all of these so-called identity groups share in common? You've already pointed out. We are poor, we're facing an insecure future, we are workers. And you would never know. Interrupt me if I'm talking too much, so I want to give you another example.
No, you are not talking too much.
You know what comes out of the universities? I'm a professor, and I honestly get, really very disgusted really with a lot of things that come out of the universities because you get I'll just use the common term now, this wokeism that actually obscures who are really the rulers and what is really the struggle of 90% of people in the United States and around the world. And they all, kind of losing my train of thought here.
Sorry.
But,
no, you're good.
One of the things we've been taught to think about and to focus on is, again, introduce a term, disparitism.
Yes.
Disparity. So this is what I always tell my students. Foundations give funding for research. Right? They give billions of dollars for the universities to do research. Where do the foundations get their funding? From corporations. So this starts from the corporate elite, from the capitalist class. They give money to foundations. The foundations then fund research on universities. I'm a sociologist. I will never get funded by the foundations because foundations fund the type of research they want to see. Research which will directly or indirectly prop up the existing political, economic, ideological system. So you get funding these days if you're in sociology and you want to study inequality, for instance. You get funding to do studies to discover disparities. The example I want to give is, and let me go into this detail, was about, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, the Ford Foundation gave a giant grant, it was hundreds of thousands or maybe a few $1,000,000 to a nonprofit, a non-governmental organization in Los Angeles to study pay differentials between white male healthcare workers and black female healthcare workers in Los Angeles or in Southern California. And they spent all of this money and they came up with the following, and these are not the exact figures because I don't have the paperwork in front of me, but approximately the black female healthcare workers were making $14.90 an hour. The white male healthcare workers were making $15.80 an hour. So that was the study that was funded, spending hundreds of thousands, maybe several $1,000,000 for this study. Right. And then when it comes out, all of the mass media, massive national coverage, there's a disparity, there's racial inequality in the healthcare sector in Southern California. And what is obscured, and intentionally obscured, that you make $15.80 an hour, that's poverty wages. You make $14.90
exactly.
an hour.
I was about to say, the problem is the fact that you guys are below $40 an hour, because try living on $15 an hour, period. Okay.
Exactly.
Give the black female $2 more, she's still in poverty. It doesn't matter. The problem here is, how the fuck does anybody survive below $40 an hour in this region of the country?
Exactly. But now the second part of that story is, so therefore, what is the conclusion, political conclusion that comes out of that? Oh, there's mild racial inequality here. And what does not come out of that both groups of workers should be demanding from the corporate healthcare system, the corporate military, the corporate medical industrial complex, demanding that they pay decent living wages and security for all of their employees. So that type of struggle, which is a united working class struggle against corporate capital, is erased. And that's the purpose.
While the focus on disparity may appear to be benevolent and may appear to be concerning about how black women aren't getting paid as much as white men, like you said, it completely shadows the beast behind both of them that's crushing them economically.
Exactly. And undermines their unity. It is true that that's an injustice, that there's roughly $1 pay difference. That's true.
The white man should be just as much pissed as the black woman as how much he's getting paid. And if they both bond together and say, hey, how in the hell are you going to pay us that much when you are making billions off of our labor in the healthcare industry?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Precisely. That's how you undermine working class unity. That's how you undermine and sabotage the possibility of class consciousness.
Yeah.
And instead, what kinds of consciousness people have? An identity consciousness.
Yes. Absolutely. Great. This is gold. This is gold in words. If words can be weighed in gold, this is it. So one thing I wanted to open up this next section on is the beautiful term TCC, which Chris told me. And I was just like, that's the word I've been looking for my whole life. We're fed this narrative that the conflicts around the world is the result of nation states finding nation states.
Exactly.
And I've always had this mindset for a long time where I'm like, something's off here. This whole back and forth, as Chris put it, tennis match between these imperialist giants towards each other, I've always been suspicious of it. I'm just like, something is off. I don't think it's about nation state versus nation state. I really don't believe that Putin truly cares about the glory of Russia and the Russian people.
Exactly.
I don't believe that Trump cares about the glory and health and sovereignty of the United States and the people of the United States. And I don't believe that, Saudi Arabia cares about the Saudi people.
Exactly.
I don't think that's what's going on here.
Exactly.
And so the way I've described it upon, being educated about this term, the TCC, is I used a metaphysical analogy. Capitalism is a demon. If you get rid of the American empire, it will just go and possess another entity. If you get rid of the Russian empire or the German empire, as we've seen, the British empire, the demon just goes and possesses another entity. You can kill the body, but the demon leaves the body and will go and infest another area. And we see this through multinational corporations. They have no loyalties.
Exactly.
So when you watch the news and you see Donald Trump stand up there and says, we need to start helping the American people. This is good for America. America is being ripped off. And we're going to we're going to bring back the power of America's coming back. When he uses the term America, that's what turns on his base. Oh, it's going to be me. That's what he means by America. No. America means the multinational corporations in Wall Street. It doesn't mean you. It means they're going to win. So the concept that us making measures around the world that we think is going to empower us financially here on all tiers of society, it's a red herring. You just have to replace the word America with multinational corporations, which have no loyalty to whatever country they infest. So again, I had to go there with a metaphysical analogy. Capitalism is a demon. It will leave a body and possess another one. It has no loyalties. It has no borders. So I wanted to go into this term, TCC.
Yeah, well, you've put it fantastically. And before I jump into, so I and several colleagues and comrades of mine, we've developed the concept of the TCC, the transnational capitalist class, to refer to the capitalist class, which is now global. They intersect with each other, they cross-invest with each other, they share the same class interests as the global ruling class all around the world. Before I jump into that, I just want to go back to the first part of what you were saying. Now, this is very hard for a lot of people to swallow, but it has to be said. Nationalism is not in our interests. Because what nationalism says is that you're a poor, precarious worker in the United States. Because you're a U.S. citizen, you share something with billionaires who are U.S. citizens. You share something with high-income people that are U.S. citizens. The homeless people in Skid Row in Los Angeles share something because they're U.S. citizens with the people that live in Beverly Hills. Okay, so that's what nationalism says. We're all the members of the same country, so we share the same interests, and we have interests that are antagonistic to people in China, people in Russia, people in Mexico, etc. That's the role of nationalism. It says everyone within a given territory shares the same interests, and that obscures the radically different and antagonistic interests of poor working people and their rich and high-income, powerful people in those same borders. So just as you said, Putin represents oligarchs and rulers and wealthy people in Russia, but he represents more than that. He defends transnational capital. So let me go back, but I want to say that first, because it's easy now these days to identify how racism is used by the ruling group to divide poor and working people. But it's harder for us to understand how nationalism also is an instrument to divide poor and working people more than ever in this age of globalization. So the idea of the transnational capitalist class is this: ever since we've had capitalism, we've had a capitalist class grabbing more and more resources, more and more land, more and more wealth. They own the factories, they own the banks, they own the mines, they own the plantations, and all of us below, we're some a little better off, some a little worse off, all of us are below and are giving our labor and being exploited by capital. Okay, we used to think of that in terms of the nation state.
Yes.
But now it is worldwide. There are U.S. corporations that go and exploit Chinese labor. There's Chinese corporations that come to the United States and exploit U.S. labor. And as you said, these transnational corporations have no loyalty to any one nation state. They play nation states and governments against one another. They play working classes against one another, and this is how they reproduce their rule. And what we've had in the last 50 years of capitalist globalization, when you really get these corporations becoming global, totally global, they're no longer moored in any particular nation state. You get an unbelievable, unprecedented concentration of wealth worldwide. So by the time we get to the end of the 2010s, when we get to 2020, 1% of humanity controls 52% of the world's wealth. It's hard to wrap your mind around that.
Yeah.
And 20% of humanity, which is that portion of humanity that can somehow get by, increasingly it's even less than 20%, controls 95% of the world's wealth. So think about that. 80% of humanity is only 5% of the world's wealth. So you have this unbelievable concentration of power and wealth in that 1%. In that 1%. Okay? And that's the transnational capitalist class. They call the shots. They structure global finance. Okay? They control everything. They build up a global police state. And you know, the world's people have never faced such a dictatorship of transnational capital in the literal sense. The term dictatorships comes from dictate. Dictate meaning you can define and decide what's going to happen. Okay. So we know we're all powerless. We're not powerless when we organize, when we fight back.
But all you need to do is get up at 4 a.m. and hustle harder, and you might be in that 1% someday.
You just
compete with your neighbor, and maybe you'll get to that 1%. And you don't have to worry about all this.
Sure.
Yeah.
And of course, statistically, you have more of a chance of getting hit twice by lightning and surviving than you do of winning the lottery.
No, you're a buzzkill, man. I was hoping for working myself up the corporate ladder if I just work hard enough. Going back to what you're saying, I think one of the best microcosms and examples of that, illustrations of what you're saying, this lack of loyalty, is what's happening in Gaza. See, a lot of people are focused on AIPAC and the lobby that AIPAC is bribing our politicians. And we've been trying to drive this point home on this platform as much as possible, that AIPAC is but a sliver of the money that's coming out of this genocide. And why we see AIPAC everywhere, AIPAC, AIPAC, AIPAC. Look at AIPAC. Is because they don't want us to focus on the stock dividends that are going to be coming from the investment in the real estate companies, which are the largest lobbying group in the United States. They pump the most money into our politicians is the real estate companies. And why is that connected to Gaza? It's connected to Gaza the same way that's connected with the fact that Americans cannot afford homes, because real estate companies bought up 40% of real estate during COVID, or at least they reached 40%. Those same real estate companies are waiting for Gaza to become ethnically cleansed. And the investors in those real estate companies, mostly I believe it goes up to Blackstone. Blackstone is the ultimate one. The Saudis are invested in these real estate companies. Their money is tied up in American real estate. Those will be the companies who will be benefiting off of Gaza when they develop it into, well, inshallah, hopefully they don't, but if they take over Gaza and if it is ethnically cleansed, they turn it into their resort, they turn it into their port city. Saudis are going to benefit off of the death of Muslims.
Exactly. One, you don't need to interview me because you already got it all down. But
no, don't get me. These concepts, I came up with that conclusion based on conversations I had with Chris and Josh, based on conversations they had with you. So it all is tied together.
Yeah. So let's unravel this, because you've just hit the nail on the head. So when Israel started its genocide, I'm talking about, this was late 2023. The CEO of Morgan Stanley, giant global financial conglomerates, and they're all cross-invested. So BlackRock, Morgan Stanley, the giant banks, Citibank, all of them, the Chinese banks, they all own shares in the military-industrial corporations. And in turn, they all own shares in the high-tech corporations. So all of this capitalist groups and sectors, they're all cross-penetrated, and that's why we call it the transnational capitalist class. You can't piece them apart into nation states. You can't piece them apart into different specific corporations. They're all interlocked. But that's not where I'm going. Where I want to go is that when Israel started its genocide, immediately all of this money that we've paid for from the U.S. state goes to the military-industrial corporations to send weapons to Israel. And Morgan Stanley is one of the financial conglomerates invested in those military-industrial corporations. The CEO of Morgan Stanley says, this Gaza war is great for our portfolio. So what does that tell us? The global bankers need and want war and conflict and genocide to make profit. It's wonderful for them. For the world's people, for the people of Ukraine and Russia, that war is a disaster. For Palestinians and for anyone that identifies with Palestinians, this genocide is a disaster. The transnational capitalist class looks at the war against immigrants here in the United States, looks at the war in Ukraine, looks at the genocide in Palestine, looks at the conflict in the Congo, and doesn't say any of this is a disaster. They say this is all fantastic. It's all new opportunities for profit making. So you're pointing out correctly something here crucially important, that capitalism, and we haven't gotten into this yet, capitalism is in deep crisis, global capitalism. We'll get into that in a minute, but part of that crisis is that the global capitalism doesn't see where else to expand. How do you open up new opportunities for profit making? How can you access new resources which will be wildly profitable? And then the transnational capitalist class, just like you said, looks at Gaza and says, I see real estate, I see gas and oil, I see a new canal to intensify global trade going right through Gaza, and I see that there's something in the way. The Palestinians, they need to be genocided, or they need to be ethnically cleansed so we can get at that profit making in that little piece of territory. Just as we can have to ethnically cleanse Eastern Congo so we can get at that profit making. And here is the thing that you just pointed out. Who is investing and wanting to radically expand investment and profit making in the Middle East? It's not one specific company, one specific country. It's the transnational capitalist class. The Saudis have massive investments in BlackRock. Hey, the Chinese have investments in BlackRock. Hey, the Emirates, the United Arab Emirates, the ruling groups there, the investor groups, they have investments. So we tend to think it's Jews against Muslims.
Yeah.
Right, it's Arab is against Israelis. No, it's transnational capital against the mass of poor working and surplus Palestinian people.
Surplus humanity.
Surplus humanity.
I'm so glad you pointed that out, because towards the beginning of the genocide, I was frustrated with the conversation of Jews versus Muslims and all this identity bullshit that has nothing to do with what's going on. And I remember I had an Israeli friend at the time. Right after October 7th, I called him up and I said, I hope you're not buying this bullshit. I hope you know what's about to happen. I hope you know what this is all about. They're manufacturing consent to take that land because corporations want it. First thing I said to an Israeli guy I knew, and we stopped being friends like a few days later, because I said, do not go down this dark path of revenge because of October 7th. You know this, you see it lining up, and it didn't work out. But what was my train of thought? The identity, the whole airspace regarding the genocide has been filled up with talks about anti-Semitism, Jewish, Muslim, whatever. Everything but the whole reason why this is going down is because BlackRock wants that land. They want to make a port city to create that corridor of trade that goes all the way from India down to Saudi Arabia. And the investment of Saudi Arabia reminds me of this, and I want to go back even further just for a second. What you're talking about, Morgan Stanley. Okay. We've seen this happen before. During the rise of the Third Reich, the funders, the ones who financed Adolf Hitler, J.P. Morgan Chase, the Warburgs were Jewish bankers.
Exactly.
They financed Hitler. Did it matter that they were Jewish? It obviously doesn't fucking matter, because they were the elites. They were Jewish capitalist elites financing a Christian capital elite to massacre Jews and Christian poor people. And so we get tangled up in this, the Jews run the world. Look, it's like, no, it's the elite Jews, it's the elite Christians, it's the elite atheists, it's the elite Muslims fucking over all the poor groups in their own, and they're using their identity as cover and as a hegemony, as a buffer zone. So the Warburgs, all the bankers who might be Jewish, or all the sheiks who are Muslim, they'll use their identity as a buffer zone for them.
Precisely and exactly. I mean, again, you're hitting the nail on the head here. If I may expand the conversation a bit to talk about, because I want to get back to the issue of Palestinians being surplus humanity.
Yes.
And what Palestine in this genocide is doing is holding a mirror up to us and saying, this is what awaits people all over the world if they get away with this genocide in Palestine. So let me back up and try and frame this in the context of the crisis of global capitalism. Right now, we have a single globalized capitalism. And again, the ruling class there is the transnational capitalist class. And this global capitalism is in deep crisis. There's 4 dimensions to the crisis. We have to talk about this. One is, of course, the ecological crisis. The biosphere is collapsing. put that aside for a minute. The other three dimensions is, first of all, there's an economic or a structural crisis of global capitalism. I'm going to use a technical term. It's called overaccumulation. And what that means is that the transnational capitalist class has accumulated all of this wealth, unbelievable amounts of wealth. That's the 1% of humanity controls 52% of the world's wealth. And because the vast majority of humanity can no longer consume. We're not a market. They don't, where do you unload and keep profit making? Capitalism is a system where you have to constantly keep expanding.
Yes.
Capitalism can't stay still. It can't be static. You have to constantly open up new spaces for accumulation, for profit making. You have to seize new resources. You have to find new labor pools to exploit. You have to expand outward, right? And so right now, the capitalist system is running out because global markets are saturated. There's industrial overcapacity. There's no way to expand. So there's this structural crisis, and it creates incredible pressures for where can you expand. That's where Gaza comes in. That's a place where global capitalism can still expand.
Yes.
But I'll come back to that for a minute. So you have this structural crisis. Technically, we call it overaccumulation or chronic stagnation in the global economy. And how do you expand? You have to do so violently. Wars is a good way of expanding. Genocide's a good way of expanding. But I'll come back to that. The second dimension of this crisis is political. It's a crisis of state legitimacy, of capitalist hegemony, right? People around the world don't see the system as legitimate. That's where Trump comes in, of course, and all, you have to redirect all of that mass discontent because the system's not seen as legitimate because it's not. Mm-hmm. It doesn't meet the needs of the world's population. The third dimension of the crisis, and this is where Palestine and surplus humanity come in, is a crisis of what we technically call social reproduction, meaning that billions of people cannot survive at this point. They can't reproduce themselves. They can't reproduce their communities. Social disintegration is taking place all over the world. The collapse of whole communities. Look at rural America. The opioids is taking over 100,000 lives a year, devastating rural communities. So the third dimension of this crisis of survivability, of technically we call it social reproduction and social disintegration. But let me go back to what's happening is that more and more people around the world are surplus, meaning they're surplus humanity. This capitalist system has no use for them. They're just standing in the way. They can potentially rebel, right? And so the ruling groups are fearful that surplus humanity will rise up and rebel. So they have to be managed. They have to be contained. They have to be controlled. Now, let me give a couple of examples. The case of Israel and of the Palestinians. When Israel's created in 1948, I'm not going to go through all of the history, and then especially after 1967 and the West Bank and Gaza are invaded and are occupied, the Palestinians are now subject to occupation, to apartheid, but they're still working for the capitalists in Israel. They leave the West Bank during the day and they go and work on plantations in Israel. They go and work in construction in Israel. They go and work in services in Israel. And then at nighttime they have to go back to the West Bank. They're still being exploited as workers. But starting in the 1990s, for a reason we don't need to go into now, but actually we should go into. Starting in the 1990s, the Israeli rulers said, we don't want to use this Palestinian labor. Let's start employing transnational migrant labor. And this Israeli state and the Israeli corporation start importing workers from India, from the Philippines, from China, from Pakistan, from Sri Lanka, from Ethiopia, even from Eastern Europe, from Kenya. And they start getting all of these transnational migrant workers. If you're a transnational migrant worker temporarily in Israel, you don't have any claims to land. You don't have any claims to the state, to political rights as a citizen. So that's a better worker to be super exploited in Israel than the Palestinians. So you switch out transnational migrant workers in Israel for Palestinians. Now the Palestinians are surplus humanity. They provide no services for global capitalism in Israel. And so, how do you manage them? Genocide, ethnic cleansing or genocide. And that's why you're seeing this genocide in Palestine. Okay? Because there's no use for those Palestinians. They serve no purpose for global capitalism. So something similar is going on here in the United States and around the world with transnational migrant labor, which we can go back to later. But here's what I want to say. I want to conclude this story by saying that more and more around the world, more and more people are no longer needed by global capitalism, simply surplus. In rural United States, masses of those poor white communities, they're surplus. They're unemployed, structurally unemployed. They're surplus. Get rid of them through opioids. There's other ways of getting rid of surplus humanity or controlling surplus humanity, and it's mass imprisonment. So the Gaza model, the ruling groups say, and by the way, the figure is 2 billion right now. 2 billion people are structurally thrown out of the global economy, marginalized, useless for global capitalism. One option, the Gaza option, genocide them.
Yeah.
Genocide them in Sudan. Genocide them in the Congo. They're just standing in the way. Okay. The other option the ruling groups have is mass imprisonment. So yes, we have it in the United States, but El Salvador here is the model. I call it the Salvadoran option.
Yeah.
You have the biggest prison in the world, 40,000 people. Do you know after that prison was built, all of these other countries around the world saying, we're going to build mega prisons. One in Sri Lanka is supposed to have 60,000 people. Thailand, Turkey, Brazil, China, they all announced we're going to do mega imprisonment.
And India.
In India, mega imprisonment.
They're using, again, nationalist language to excuse getting rid of the surplus humanity through the Muslim population in India. So that's why you have Modi, who's like the Trump of India, brings up this national rejuvenation, using even mythological language, Hindu mythological language, to paint Muslims as an invading force and as a surplus humanity to get rid of them. And of course, we know India is like has the second largest population on the planet as a country. So,
right.
I've seen you mentioned the El Salvadorian prison system. I see it as like a beta test. You know, El Salvador is just a beta test. It's just a little glimpse of what's to come. You know, and we're seeing Trump start to hint that he's going to start extraditing American citizens to their prisons, going on his hot mic. You know?
Right. So, but let's link this. So let's link the issue of mega imprisonment to the issue of the economic crisis of global capitalism, and how do you continue to make profit in the face of chronic stagnation? So here in the United States, the prisons for immigrants, the prisons are all run privately. I'm sure you know that. They're run by two giant corporations, CoreCivic and Geo Group. And they make $700 every night that an immigrant is detained in their facilities. So, and in turn, they are traded on Wall Street Stock Exchange. So the global banks, you and I, if we're wealthy enough, we can buy stocks in Geo Group, we can buy stocks in CoreCivic, and then we want, not because we're racist, not because we don't like immigrants, we simply get rich by waging a war on immigrants.
Right.
Okay. So systems of transnational social control and repression become wildly profitable, and they become an outlet for continuing to make profit at a time of chronic stagnation and economic crisis in the global economy. This is where the concept of the global police state comes in.
Yes.
That the global police state, which is now all over, we've never seen such systems of mass surveillance, and there's the issue of technology and AI comes into the picture, but we'll get there in a moment. The global police state is a concept I've developed to try and explain the two things are going on at the same time. This wildly repressive, omnipresent system of mass social control, repression, and warfare, it comes into being as a global police state with two functions. One, of course, is to contain rebellions all around the world, contain surplus humanity, whether it's through private prisons such as Geo Group and Core Group, and through systems of surveillance and systems of social control and systems of police repression, and so forth. So it's police function. The other function of the global police state is it's wildly profitable.
Yes.
That's why I mentioned that Goldman Sachs said, this is great for our portfolio. Another spokesperson for the military-industrial complex, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the actual words she said is, happy days are here again.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is why when Trump won the elections and promised mass deportation, the stock value of CoreCivic and of Geo Group shot through the roof.
Yep.
And so repression and warfare and social control and prisons and genocide, all of this becomes making profit at a time when you have stagnation in the global economy. So that's the idea of global police state. And global police state is the instrument of the transnational capitalist class for control, that's the police function, and for profit making.
Yeah.
That's the accumulation function. And so this is the enemy we're facing. And as you pointed out, we get all of this ideological, cultural nonsense trying to confuse us as to what's really going on. Where is the danger coming from? It's coming from above. It's coming from the transnational capitalist class. It's coming from a global capitalist system which is utterly out of control and is simply based on expanding and expanding profit-making opportunities at the expense of death and destruction and blood. And just look at Palestine. That's the future of all of humanity. That's why the struggle to defend Palestine, the struggle against this genocide, is really a struggle of all of humanity in this stage that we are moving into.
The main entree that we are working up to. I want you to watch this video. It's an odd video to segue into, and you might be confused about why I'm showing. You'll probably figure it out. Divert your attention here real quick.
Ready to patrol the streets of Los Angeles, rocked by widespread violence.
My name's Alex Jones. I'm a radio and television host in Austin, Texas. And for many years, I've been exposing the criminal activities of the global elite, otherwise known as the New World Order. These folks don't make their money out of the production of goods and services or via creativity. They make their money, and their stock and trade is slavery, control of populations. In the next 2 hours, you will see hardcore documentation, evidence that is irrefutable that America is turning into a nightmarish police state. Cameras on the street corners, mass checkpoints on our major interstate highways, warrantless searches. But worst of all, you'll see America's military being perverted, being turned into an instrument of control, not an instrument of defense. I have footage, and you're going to see it, of Marines engaging in mock gun confiscations, kicking in doors, setting up concentration camps, and working with foreign troops from China.
Can you spot, like Waldo, the irony in that video? Has to think about his audience for a second. Think of the demographics, the subcultures that usually watched that guy back in his day. And think of those same subcultures now. Where's the irony here? The poetry, I guess.
Yeah. Well, there's two things. One is, of course, we're told that the U.S. military is meant to defend people in the United States against the Chinese military, the Russian military. They're cooperating there. But the other irony there is he's suggesting that suddenly the U.S. military has a different function. The U.S. military has always had the function of defending, U.S. and global empire. But there's another thing, there's another thing too. I don't know. I mean, there's multiple ironies there. The other thing, of course, is that people that go into the military are poor and working people that either go in, well, if you're drafted in earlier moments in your history, you're drafted into it.
The demographic that religiously follow, I used to follow that guy once upon a time, back in 2010, 2011. Well, like you said, multiple ironies and ones you pointed out as well, but his audience, those same people, are now have Back the Blue stickers on the back of their trucks and cars. During the George Floyd protest, there was this sudden fervor to back the blue, back the police. Those same people were his audience, main audience members. And it's ironic that you were able to convert an audience base like that, who used to follow this guy and based on what he's saying, to now cheer on a police state. That's the magic of cultural hegemony and propaganda. It's a magic. You have to brand something that you would be horrified normally to make it appealing and make it cool, make it a cultural icon for certain demographics. So Bible Belt rednecks, working class folks, were able to be seduced into cheering on a police state as long as you can brand it with a certain flavor. Trump was that flavor. Exactly. He was the guy who was able, and that's why I always say that we are living in, as you're aware of, the Vietnam War syndrome. The Vietnam War syndrome, for the audience members who don't know, was the anti-war sentiments that culminated as a result of the Vietnam War. Americans want nothing to do with war. George Bush bragged, I have conquered the Vietnam War syndrome. But now we're in the Afghan War syndrome. Americans definitely don't want war. So how do you conquer that? You have to have a person who can make it appealing. So you put a Trump out there, a rogue billionaire who cares about the working class.
Right.
And he wants to bring law and order back to this country because the globalists want to create chaos in the United States. So so they have used, like you said, the cultural judo, the social judo, to force the momentum away from the elite class to actually cheer on a police state. That's the irony of that. That same guy, Alex Jones, is now cheering on
Oh, that's
Donald
Alex
Trump.
Jones?
That's Alex Jones.
Oh, I didn't recognize him.
Yeah,
He's wearing a suit.
Yeah, and he has hair.
He has hair.
Which I can't judge him for. I've lost it too. But he is now cheering on Trump, saying Trump is sticking it to the globalist. He's used
because I didn't get to that far. He's saying Trump is sticking.
Well, no. This is old.
Oh, okay.
This is an old video.
Oh. Okay.
Fast forward to now, the new Alex Jones. He's cheering on the police state because Trump is behind the wheel, quote unquote. When he's actually not behind the wheel. It's his corporate masters who are behind the wheel. But that's the irony. So this is a great segue into your book, The Global Police State, which you wrote, which is an amazing book from what I've read so far. I'm a slow reader. I'm still working my way through it. And I kind of want to segue into this based on what you wrote. Page 3, you wrote, by global police state, I refer to 3 interrelated developments. First is the ever more omnipresent systems of mass social control, repression, and warfare promoted by the ruling groups to contain the real and the potential rebellion of the global working class and surplus humanity, as we referred to before. Savage global inequalities are politically explosive, and to the extent that the system is simply unable to incorporate surplus humanity, it turns to ever more violent forms of containment. The methods of control include sealing out the surplus population through border and other containment walls, deportation regimes, mass incarceration, and spatial apartheid, alongside omnipresent new systems of state and private surveillance and criminalization of the poor and working class. They also include the deadly new modalities of policing and repression made possible by applications of digitization and the fourth industrial revolutionary technologies. The global police state brings all of global society into what in Pentagon jargon is called battle space, concentrated in the world's megacities that are home to more than half of humanity. Let's talk about that. Let's go into that. What did you mean by that?
Right. So that's the first dimension of global police state. And so, again, so there are 2 things happening worldwide. One is that more and more people, now numbering in the billions, are simply locked out. They're expelled from the global economy and society. The ruling groups, the global capitalist system, has no use for them. And what do you do when you have no way of surviving? You rebel. You may rebel by overthrowing the government, by making a revolution. You may rebel by social violence and by small-scale crime sprees. Whatever it is, the more and more of humanity simply does not fit in. You're surplus. You're just expelled. You're useless. You can either quietly die or you can fight back in some way. And so global police state needs to contain the actual rebellion underway in some places and the potential rebellion of surplus humanity. But those that still do have employment, those that still can try and survive, are increasingly facing a precarious existence, are increasingly facing not stable employment, but underemployment and precarious employment and non-living wages. So the vast majority of humanity simply cannot survive in this global capitalist system. So the first dimension of global police state is contain and control this vast majority of humanity. Those made surplus and expelled, those integrated into the global economy but under the conditions of precariousness and increasingly intensified exploitation. And so global police state has to kick in and control that mass of humanity. That's the first dimension of global police state. And it's not the old forms of control. I mean, police with batons and with guns, yeah, you have that. The old-fashioned militaries, send in the Marines, you still have that, of course. But now you have the new digital technologies, and they're incredibly powerful. And so there's new digital methods of control. Every one of us has a smartphone, and the smartphone is a way of tracking just about our every single movement in our location. You now have, as that little clip showed, you now have systems of global surveillance, satellite surveillance, and CCTV surveillance. I mean, it's omnipresent, and it's getting more and more, unbelievable. Artificial intelligence creates this ability for total 24-hour, 7/7 surveillance of everyone on the planet. So you have the old forms of actual physical coercion and control of any type of uprising, any type of resistance, and then you have the ability to manipulate space and surveillance to actually keep an eye on all of humanity and jump in with the police state when there's any threat to the established social order and to the ruling groups. That's the first of these three dimensions of global police state that I'm referring to. And there's something else going on here too, is that, and this, or maybe you want to jump into the second dimension because now it intersects.
Yeah, let's do that. Let me read it. Second is how the global economy is itself based more and more on the development and deployment of these systems of warfare, social control, and repression, simply as a means of making profit and continuing the accumulated capital in the face of stagnation. What I term militarized accumulation, or accumulation by repression. If it is evident that unprecedented global inequalities can only be sustained by ubiquitous systems of social control and repression, it has become equally evident that, quite apart from political considerations, the ruling groups have acquired a vested interest in war, conflict, and repression as a means of accumulation. As war and state-sponsored violence becomes increasingly privatized, the interest of a broad array of capitalist groups shift the political, social, and ideological climate towards generating and sustaining social conflict, such as in the Middle East, and in expanding systems of warfare, repression, surveillance, and social control. We are now living in a veritable global war economy.
Yeah, so this is the second dimension of global police state. And let's remember something about the capitalist system. The capitalist class, in this case it has gone global, so it's a transnational capitalist class, has one interest and one interest only: to continue to make profit, to continue to accumulate capital, continue to expand outward where and how you can make profit. It doesn't matter how you can make profit as long as you make profit. You can make profit by building a hospital, but that's not profitable for global capitalism right now. You can make profit by building and giving houses to the homeless, but that's not profitable. And so because we have this structural or economic crisis of global capitalism, increasing stagnation, and why do we have that stagnation? Again, this is going to be a little technical, but it's really important. If, let's say I'm a capitalist, and let's say I have a factory of 30,000 workers, and they go on strike and they're unruly. And also my biggest portion of my outlays is paying 30,000 workers. So I want to get rid of them. I want to replace them with technology. Increasingly, as capitalism has developed, as it's gone global in the last 30, 40, 50 years with the new technologies, I've replaced human beings increasingly with technology. As we speak now, there are what's called lights out factories in China, meaning that there are no human beings, all robots, all artificial intelligence. And that's why they call it lights out, because you don't need lights inside. But where am I getting at with that? As capitalism has continued to develop, more and more people are expelled. And as the global market therefore shrinks. Several billions of people can't consume. The global market shrinks. So the global capitalist system puts out all of this wealth, all of these goods and services, and they cannot be absorbed by the global market. It's a little complicated to understand, but that's the thing, is that capitalism expands outward, but the market contracts, so capitalism faces stagnation. Now where can I make profit? Now where can I invest? I'm running out of spaces and opportunities. And then suddenly, investing in warfare, in social control, in repression becomes wildly profitable. It's a way of continuing to make profit, to unload your surplus capital in new ways, which is why, as I mentioned earlier in the interview, Goldman Sachs says, when the Gaza war starts, says this is great for a portfolio, because now you can make new profit and open up new space through genocide. That is why, again, the spokesperson for the military-industrial complex said when Russia invaded Ukraine, happy days are here again. But that is also why Geo Group and CoreCivic, these two private corporations which are traded on Wall Street, why their stock shoots up when you start to jail immigrants. But it's not just that. It's at any and every level that repression, that social control and warfare itself becomes wildly profitable in multiple senses. So let's look at this for a minute. The Salvadoran government builds a detention center, a jail that holds 40,000 people. Okay, why is that profitable? Because now the Salvadoran government is saying to the United States, sure, you pay us and we lock up people. Okay, so that's profitable. So in every dimension, warfare, repression, surveillance become wildly profitable. Did you know, I mean, everyone knows what the CIA is, the Central Intelligence Agency, and people assume that when the Central Intelligence Agency gathers intelligence, that's the government doing that. That's not true. That stopped several decades ago. Yeah. The CIA outsources to private corporations intelligence gathering. So I mean, this goes on and on and on. The book that you mentioned, the Global Police State book, has hundreds and hundreds of examples. Anything and everything. There are more private security guards than public police in the world as we speak today. So, I mean, this goes on and on. Every single dimension of repression, warfare, social control is wildly profitable. And it's a way of keeping the global economy going at a time of chronic stagnation. Just to show you the extreme is, I forgot the term, I discussed it in the book, but it's the riot control industry. Just, we'll call it that. It's very similar term. So, the Lloyd's of London. Now, Lloyd's is very interesting because Lloyd's is a global financial and insurance conglomerate. And Lloyd's of London, which is still very active today, goes back to the slave trade because it was the insurer for the slave ships.
Right.
So Lloyd's of London released a report, which I discussed in that book, in which it said that the riot control industry, meaning all of this equipment which goes to police to quell riots around the world, which they are anticipating, that's already an industry was worth like something like $20-30 billion. Don't quote me, the figure is actually in the book on the exact amount. But again, it gives it. So again, if there's inequality, there's mass unemployment, people are hungry, maybe there's a civic uprising. And just the equipment used, the riot gear used to put down a civic uprising also is a source of wonderful profit. So if you are a global capitalist, you want civic strike. You want political conflict. You want instability. That's why, as you know, we were discussing earlier in the interview, chaos, the collapse of the U.S. state, instability, that's great. That's wonderful for the global police state because this generates new and ever more opportunities for private profit making at a time of stagnation. But we have to think about how in every level, the global police state becomes a profit-making enterprise, and without that profit-making enterprise, the global economy would collapse. So it's not just that in 2003 the U.S. invades, of course illegally, invades and occupies Iraq, and that's a giant boom for the military-industrial complex. It's more than that. So you have several 100,000 troops. I think you would probably know the exact figure, how many U.S. troops were there in Iraq in 2003. But so those troops need to be fed.
Yeah.
So all of the transnational corporations that prepare food and deliver that food and so forth also need global police state to make profit.
Yeah.
So they need to be clothed. So global textile industry. So, I mean, you can start putting two and two together. It's not just the actual military hardware and the military-industrial corporations that want and need a global police state and need war. But think of the supply systems. Now, all of the transnational capitalists get involved on this. I have it somewhere in the book there, but there's so much data I don't remember it all. But in the invasion and occupation of Iraq, some of these other corporations hired to bring in food supplies and other supply chains to keep that conflict going. They were outsourced to Saudi companies, to East African companies, to Chinese corporations. So they all get in on the action. The other thing about global police state with regard to a profit-making enterprise is the actual military and police force opens up access to resources that otherwise would not be opened up. So right now, all of these weapons are going to these paramilitary groups in the Congo. That's today's headlines.
Yeah.
Those paramilitary groups, so whoever sells those weapons to the paramilitary groups makes billions of dollars in profits.
Yeah.
Then the paramilitary groups go and terrorize villages that have to run away. And once they've run away, the minerals are there for the taking. And so the mining corporations come in and take the minerals. But that was made possible by the global police state. So, I mean, it goes on and on. You see that every aspect of the global economy is now integrated into the global police state as a profit-making enterprise. So we have two of the three dimensions of global police state already discussed, right? The need to control and repress surplus humanity, the global working class. And the second dimension, that doing so is itself wildly profitable at a time of chronic stagnation.
Right. It's like waste not, want not, except not
Yes.
for us, for the
Right.
ruling class. This was, by the way, also in this interview, I am representing the Panther Party as well. So I asked them what questions they would like to ask a man of your caliber. And you were talking about privatization and the Pentagon and Langley outsourcing. Palantir. Thinking of Palantir. And the current Trump administration calling us citizens homegrowns in relation to deporting criminals and non-criminals of all sorts to El Salvador. Palantir is finally becoming known now. It really flew under the radar for a long time. I didn't hear about it until this past year. Never heard of Palantir. And yet it's one of the most critical companies that is going to be the mercenary of all of this. It's going to be the one that's capitalizing off of this global police state, as you talk about. So the Palantir company, with all of its digital outreach, I guess this is where we kind of will be diving into solutions, is how do we educate your average American who might be caught up in these identity politics? How do we educate them that companies like Palantir, and by cheering on this global police state, back to blue, seeing this bulldozing of constitutional rights by ICE, how it's going to boomerang on them too, through companies like Palantir, right? They're so focused on getting these immigrants out and they're cheering it on, and they don't realize that this is setting the stage for a tightly controlled environment where anybody at any time can be the target of the global police state.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Palantir for a minute, because Palantir is a high-tech corporation.
Right.
So it's symbolic of a larger, qualitatively new stage in the development of digital technology based on artificial intelligence. And maybe it wasn't one of the Palantir spokespeople, I don't remember which of the big tech corporations, I think it was actually, it might have been Peter Thiel, or it might have been the CEO, I think Karp is his last name, of Palantir, said, what are we going to do with unskilled, with manual labor in the United States? We're going to replace it with AI. Mm-hmm. So, you know, people that, you know, working people, citizens, disproportionately white, but not just white, you know, white workers and other workers who are citizens who think you should back the blue, and once the immigrants go, you'll be great and you'll have great jobs, are simply headed also for structural unemployment, to become surplus humanity. Right now, again, with this qualitatively new stage, artificial intelligence can not just replace manual labor. And I gave the example of China, where you have factories where there's literally no human beings. And that's the future of industry worldwide. Even, you know, Trump, this is a lot of rhetoric, but so Trump is imagining this scene where you reindustrialize the United States, where industry that fled the United States to go to cheap labor zones, starting in the 1980s and 1990s and intensifying in the 21st century. In Trump's Alice in Wonderland world, these industries are going to come back to the United States and give good, high-paying, stable industrial jobs to U.S. citizens. Well, even if those industries were going to come back, they're all automated. They're all robotized. There's no employment. The future of global industry is the future of artificial intelligence and robotization. So anyone that's saying, you know, let's support the police state because we can get rid of immigrants and we'll get back our good jobs that we've lost, is only fooling themselves. They should realize they lost their good jobs because global capitalism is crushing them as part of the working class. And that this global police state is going after the most vulnerable elements to start with, which are immigrants. And then everyone else is next, or is already there.
Yes.
But I want to go back to the issue of Palantir, because again, I believe it was Peter Thiel himself that said, we're going to replace manual labor with AI. But it's not just manual labor. The new AI emerging and consolidating and advancing at warp speed right now is able to generate its own algorithms. And what does that mean? The storyline used to be that, sure, the industrial jobs go away because robots do the industrial labor. But we control the robots through our computers. So everyone's going to get good, high-tech computer jobs.
Yeah.
Well, we know that didn't happen anyway. Only some people got those jobs.
Yeah.
But what did they do? They coded, right? They ran and developed the software and the hardware to run computers and to run robots. But now AI is able to generate its own algorithms, meaning that you don't even need programmers, meaning that professional jobs, managerial jobs, all of this that 20% I was mentioning earlier, that can so far survive in global capitalism, that 20% is also going to become precariatized and redundant. Okay. And so, you know, anyone that thinks that if you're 90% of humanity, you have a dim future with where we're going. If you think propping up a global police state is going to help you, you don't understand what's going on and that this system is coming for you as well. You'd better think about uniting with all that rest of that 90% of humanity if you want to have a future for yourself and your children.
Absolutely.
So there's something else going on here which is really important, and it is the issue of privatization. And so if someone's not familiar with that, they may think, oh, that's something good, you know, and private enterprise is great. But first of all, private enterprise is not for 90% of us. We don't own any property. We might own our home, we might own our car, usually the bank owns it.
Yep.
But property doesn't mean our personal property, the clothes, you know, our house, our car, our electronic goods. Property means the means of production. Who owns the banks? Who owns the giant global manufacturing corporations? Who owns the mines? Who owns the plantations? And that's 1, 2, 3% of humanity. But I want to link this, and I know this a little technical, but I think we must understand how the system works if we want to fight it and save ourselves. So capitalism, again, is a system where you can like capitalism and not like capitalism. It's not really important if you like it. What's important is the capitalist system has to constantly expand outward. You have to take more and more nature, more and more human beings, more and more of the world, and turn it into something that's profitable, profit-making. So we've had public spheres, we have public education, we've had public health, we have a public post office, we have public infrastructure, well, we did. Most countries have, most of these things are public. And so what the transnational capitalist class wants to do is turn that into profit making. If you have a public post office, there's no private profit being made. So you have to get rid of the post office, and you have to private corporations like FedEx and UPS and other private corporations take over all mail delivery. If you have a public health system, that's not making profit for private corporations. You have to privatize the health system. You have public education. Your son, you have a son, maybe he goes to public school.
Right.
So that public school is not making profit for the transnational capitalist class. You have to privatize it. So what's happened over the last 50 years of capitalist globalization, this really begins in the late 1970s, right, is that more and more of the public spheres have to be turned over to private corporations for profit making. Right now, Trump is saying he's going to open up the national parks to private corporations. So over the last 50 years, we've seen the privatization of more and more and more and more public spheres. If something is public, it's for social need. It has a social purpose. If something is privatized, its purpose is to make profit for the private corporation.
Yeah.
Okay. And so what's happening now? I want to link this to Peter Thiel and to
Palantir.
And to Palantir, which is really the cutting edge of the new corporations of the future, which represent genocide and destruction for the majority of us. So they don't just want to. Palantir doesn't want to just privatize the state. What Musk is doing there is not just getting rid of much of the state, right? And then privatizing what's left. They want to privatize the post office. They want to privatize Social Security. They want to privatize Medicare. That's part of what they're doing, Musk and Palantir and Trump and all of them. The other thing they're doing is two other things. They want to get rid of democracy itself. I'll speak to that in just a moment. But they also want to create a private state. And what do I mean by that? They want a state which is run by AI. You have AI algorithms which will run whatever left of Social Security. You don't need human beings running Social Security, but now it's run by AI, and therefore it's enormously profitable for the tech corporations that control the AI and the algorithms to run Social Security. But not just that. When Social Security is privatized, you put it in the hands of Wall Street to manage it. And so there's two ways you make profit from Social Security: by the financial conglomerates that control it and manage it, and who knows what will get left of us, those of us that need Social Security for our retirement, and then you also have the tech corporations running Social Security through algorithms. But you have this tech takeover, so you don't just have the privatization of the state and it's takeover by tech and by finance, etc., but you even have the creation of a private state. And there's an example of this. I know this sounds extreme, but in Honduras, a country in Central America, and you may have heard of this, the previous government, which was a dictatorial government, it came to power through a coup d'etat, through a military takeover. They took an island, in one of their islands, Prospera is the name of the island. Okay. And they said to Prospera, this is now your private island, a private corporate island. Our national laws don't apply here. You do whatever you want in that island, even though there was thousands of people living on the island. And do you know what corporation they turned it over to? Palantir. And so Palantir has its own private island with its own private government. It decides who and what will get taxed. It decides what infrastructure will be built and not built. It decides everything. So the larger goal here, who knows if it will happen, because it's all crisis-ridden, all of this. But the larger goal is not just to privatize what's left of the U.S. government, but to even move towards private government. Right? And that means you have to get rid of democracy. Democracy is an obstacle to capitalist expansion. Democracy just stands in the way. And so that's why you're also getting a fascist takeover, because democracy is simply an obstacle to the complete total takeover by the transnational capitalist class. The guy Yarvin, this is not conspiratorial. You've heard of the name, I forgot his first name, Yarvin. He is one of the very shadowy intellectuals that have been putting his ideas out, and his ideas have intersected with Palantir and intersected with Trump and a lot of these people that are now shadowy people in the Trump administration. Yarvin has called this the Dark Enlightenment. And his philosophy of the Dark Enlightenment is that that democracy is just a hindrance. You need to totally get rid of democracy. Just run by a technocratic elite. Run the state by a technocratic elite. And that public government is also just an obstacle. It should be a private government. So this is a nightmare future. I don't think it can possibly happen because it's too contradictory, but this is what we're moving towards, and this is part of the story of Palantir, because Palantir is not just a technology corporation and a military, industrial, and a financial corporation. It's all of that. But Palantir is a symbol. It's a reflection of where the transnational capitalist class wants to take the whole future of humanity.
Who needs a James Bond movie with a villain with a private island when you just have real life?
Honestly, global capitalism in 2025 is more unbelievable than than a James Bond movie.
It's so funny, just taking a little off ramp here for a second of levity. You watch a James Bond movie, you have this villain, one guy who has a big syndicate going on, but it's so small. In the storyline, right. James Bond, he kills the bad guy, and it's all over. Case closed. But you look at this, it's these antagonists on steroids, millions of magnitude bigger than anything you can portray in Hollywood. And which it goes again to a theory I have, the reason why Hollywood portrays these villains as being isolated incidents and rogue guys is because you want to pull the audience into thinking that this doesn't really happen, and if it does, it's just some rogue billionaire doing something, when in fact it's an entire system that you're in right now as you're watching this movie. So great. So we're going to move on to the third, which I believe you touched on. You left off on a little bit. The third is the increasing move towards political systems that can be characterized as 21st century fascism, or even in a broader sense as totalitarianism. The increasing influence around the world of devastating authoritarian and right-wing populist parties and movements, symbolizing above all by Trumpism in the United States, has sparked a flurry of debate on whether fascism is again on the rise. There has been a sharp polarization around the world between insurgent left and popular forces on one hand, and an insurgent far right on the other. A project of 21st century fascism is on the ascent in the civil societies of many countries around the world. The project has made significant advances in recent years in its competition to win state power. In some cases, it has gained a foothold in the capitalist state. At the same time, a neo-fascist culture appears to be emerging through militarism, misogyny, and racism. Such a culture generates a climate conducive to mass violence, often directed against the racially oppressed, ethnically persecuted women and poor and vulnerable communities. But a fascist outcome is not inevitable. Whether or not a fascist project manages to congeal is entirely contingent on how the struggle among social and political forces unfolds in the coming years. So, contingent. It's not inevitable, is what you're saying.
No, it's not inevitable, and we're at a really pivotal moment here. And we also need to talk about resistance, and we need to talk about the contradictions of this out-of-control system, which is in such deep crisis.
Please.
It's very contradictory. But first, let me just elaborate a little bit. We've already spoken a bit about that, but this book was published in 2020, and it usually takes up close to a year for once you finish writing a book for it to come out. So I was writing in 2019 and saying we're seeing the rise of fascism. Now we're in 2025, and here it is. It's staring right at us in the face. Exactly what I was warning about in the late 2000s and teens is now here. We have that exact fascist project that I described. It is not consolidated when we're in April, the end of April 2025. It's not consolidated, but it has now seized a significant portion of the U.S. state. Musk and Trump, they're open fascists. I mean, it's not even debatable. They're fascists. All around the world, we're seeing this new type of political figure, which, whether you want to call it fascist, in some case, Musk and Trump, they actually have fascist ideology. I mean, actual, classical ideology of
And
fascism.
again, just to be clear, these are simply the poster boys for the ruling class.
They're the poster boy, exactly.
They're there to, we focus our attention on Trump and Elon Musk, but they're just carrying water for a greater beast, a greater conglomerate.
That is real. Yes, that is really the key point. Again, the enemy that 95% of humanity faces is the transnational capitalist class.
Yes.
And that they control the global economy, the resources, the material, the economic resources upon which all of us depend for our very existence. And they turn to and put people in power politically. It sounds conspiratorial, and in one sense it is. All conspiracy means, by the way, that's another thing. We always hear conspiracy theories. Yes, there are. So a conspiracy theory is you have a theory about something and you have no empirical evidence to demonstrate if it's true. So it remains a theory. Yeah. But once you have the evidence to show something, then it's not a conspiracy theory. A conspiracy means that two or more people get together to plan some activity. Yeah. And so, of course, conspiracies take place all the time. But they're only a theory unless we have the actual empirical evidence to demonstrate, yes, this is really true.
And we're not talking about aliens abducting Elvis Presley. We're talking about business.
Of course.
And that's what I always say. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's just business.
And it's just empirical fact.
Yeah.
It's an empirical fact that in the United States, corporations spend billions and billions of dollars to get people elected that will represent their interests. And it's a fact that poor people and homeless people can't spend anything to get their representatives' interests, even if they had representatives that are going to represent their interests. I mean, this just the connection between economic power, who has real economic power and control of resources, and how they translate that into political influence over states and governments is so blatant, so historically documented, that there's really not a debate. But so here is the thing about these fascism and authoritarianism and dictatorship. There are different ways that ruling groups have to maintain their control. And very simply, we generally divide it into two consensual mechanisms of social control, meaning that you tolerate the system because either you think it's not worth rebelling against it, or you think it's right and it's just like the people you're mentioning that say, go blue?
Back the blue.
Back the blue, because they think that's going to help them, so they consent to the existing system.
Yes.
Right. And so consensual mechanisms of social control and of domination generally work. They work because you're socialized by Hollywood. We discussed that earlier in the interview. But when consensual mechanisms of social control break down, when people say, no, the system isn't working, no, I'm going to rebel, then coercive mechanisms of social control, that is direct police state actions, direct military interventions, kick in. And so that's what we are moving towards, a breakdown of these consensual mechanisms of social control, of hegemony that we spoke about earlier. And so around the world you have Erdogan in Turkey, you have the dictator Bukele in El Salvador, you have Trump and Musk and Peter Thiel here in the United States. You have Alternative for Germany in Germany, and these extreme right neo-fascist parties in Germany that are insurgent. You have in Argentina Javier Milei. I mean, and very often you have 21st century fascism where there still may be elections, but the elections are so tightly controlled by those that have economic power that they're not really elections where people vote their will. It's not the popular will. They're basically just electoral farces. But anyway, the point is that this 21st century fascism is a new form of the state, a new form of the transnational capitalist class exercising its domination that are really nightmarish. And I wrote that in 2019, warning this is coming. And now look what we have in the U.S. state. But no, it is not consolidated. We have a wannabe fascist project, which has seized the executive, which is in control of the Republican Party. The Republican Party is basically a fascist party at this point, at least the right wing that controls took over the Republican Party. You have Democrats that represent the transnational capitalist class and are basically feckless and useless at this point.
But no, they do filibusters and stuff and make big speeches, though, right?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So, yeah. And they right now, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party is speaking to the transnational capitalist class. The Republicans say, we're going to represent your interests with this outright fascist project. Democrats say, no, give us a chance again. In a few years from now, we'll represent your interests better. As you pointed out right at the beginning of the interview, these are simply two political agents of the transnational capitalist class. But that's the third dimension of global police state, and you see around the world the rise of these new state forms, these new types of government, which you have the three different types: a dictatorship, an outright dictatorship in El Salvador, one person calls the shots, or a small group of people call the shots. You have authoritarian regimes where you can still have elections, but you have increasing control from above and a breakdown of the rule of law. And you have outright fascist systems, and the three are all connected. They're not identical. In sociology, we distinguish between the three of them, but all of them represent the same thing: a breakdown of democratic mechanisms of governance and more direct, coercive mechanisms of controlling and exploiting masses of people. This distinction of fascism, let me speak to it, because we are seeing fascism in the United States rise, and it may not be consolidated. Let us hope not. So fascism, you have a reactionary far-right takeover of the state, this repressive takeover of the state. That we have. Secondly, you have the transnational capitalist class backing this project. The first Trump government, a lot of the transnational capitalists were not willing to back the Trump government, the fascist option. Right. Now they're getting on board. And again, there you have the symbolic significance of Peter Thiel and Palantir. That face of how the transnational capitalist class is saying, yes, now we are also behind fascism.
Yes.
That's the second plank of fascism.
Because the optics aren't as important anymore because he sees control. So
exactly.
It's all about the optics. It's not that they didn't want to. It's not that they thought, ooh, that's too sadistic, that's too raw. No, it's just that the public isn't ready to, we can't do it now because the public sentiments are there now. But once we can have a blitzkrieg of the executive and we can normalize it and hyper-normalize it with Americans, now it's like, who cares about the optics? Now we can go full force.
Exactly. And that's the moment we're at right now. And here's the key clincher. The third dimension of a fascist project, in distinction to authoritarianism or outright dictatorship, and everyone can recognize this as a dictatorship, is just like in classical fascism in Italy and in Germany, you have a fascist mobilization in civil society. You get a significant portion of the working masses to come on board, right? To mobilize them in civil society. And so you don't see that, for instance, in a country like Turkey. You have authoritarianism rather than fascism. You have a decreasing dictatorship of Erdogan.
Yes.
But here you have the far right-wing militias, you have this like mobilization, and the tragedy here, and we spoke about this earlier in the interview, is that there's a mass base for Trumpism, and that mass base can be mobilized as this fascist mobilization in civil society. But here is the contradiction. Okay, here is the big contradiction, because remember, this is a contradictory project. The mass base for Trumpism. Well, let's take the story back a minute, please. Let me do this.
Go ahead.
In Germany, the 1930s, Germany is the Great Depression. Germany is an unbelievable crisis. The mass of German workers, they're utterly devastated, they're starving, they're barefoot. There's an unbelievable crisis in Germany. And worse than in the United States, worse than elsewhere. And there were socialist and communist parties and trade unionists. So the Nazis come to power, the first thing they do is knock out the socialist, communist, trade unionists before they go after the Jews, before that, right? And now you have all of these workers, and the Nazi party creates a mass base among those workers, and it does so by saying to those workers, we will rescue you from your economic desperation. We will restore your security, give you a sense of, take away your anxiety over the future, over your terrible situation. And they created public works early on. I'm not talking about once the war starts.
Yeah.
Okay. And they actually did bring some material benefit to a portion of the German working class. You had to be quote unquote Aryan, right?
But it was enough to give some of the population that was the population that it needed to be on board with that fascist regime to feel like they had a stake in the game.
Exactly. Now here you have a wannabe fascism, and here's the big contradiction. The ruling groups cannot deliver to that disproportionately white working class base because the global economy is in crisis. They cannot deliver the material goods. They cannot bring back good industrial employment and stable jobs.
Right.
So this 21st century fascism faces that contradiction. So that third plank of fascism, I'm hoping fascism won't be consolidated, and I'm hoping that this mass base of Trumpism, when they see, no, on the contrary, it's going to get worse. Not only don't you have stable employment, and go take opioids and die because we're not going to be able to give you stable, good jobs, good paying jobs. Not only that, but we're going to take away your Social Security and your Medicare. So the fascist project in the US faces this contradiction. And we, popular forces from below, whether you want to call us left, it doesn't matter what you call us. You want to use it, you're left, don't use it. But those of us from below that believe that all of us poor people should come together and have a decent collective existence, right? We got to take advantage of that contradiction. We have to point out to the mass Trump base, the mass fascist base, you guys think you're going to get a payoff here, but you're going to get it worse.
This is great, because what you're saying is exactly what I've been thinking about lately and telling people. They put their hand in the cookie jar, and they're trying to pull too many cookies out of the cookie jar too quickly. We're seeing the cracks happen in Trump's base. We are seeing a mass migration out of Trumpism.
Yes.
Because the way I try to explain to people about, like, especially people on the left, because I used to be on the right a long time ago, what I tell people is Trump's base is like an onion. In the core, you have his die-hard SS fanatics, just like you had in Hitler's base. Right. On the outside of the onion, you have the ones who are in it because, well, I don't like Trump, but the economy was better under him, better than Biden, so fuck it, I'll vote for him. And then, so it goes outward to the most hardcore fanatical base that doesn't care if they were burning alive with gasoline and Trump was the one lighting it. They don't care as long as their man is winning the football game and he's looking good. They're living vicariously through him. That's your fanatical base. But as you move out of the onion, you got the people who are like not as committed, and they were only in it. We can peel off the outside of that onion and bring them over to class solidarity.
Exactly.
And then, okay, you have a fanatical base left, a core left. Okay, whatever. They're going to be outnumbered. You know, we got to go by numbers. Right. So I tell people that Trump's base is not a monolith. They're not hardcore committed all the way through their DNA. There's layers to his support base.
Exactly.
So that's what I try to explain to people, and we can take advantage of that onion if we can just start peeling it off.
Absolutely. And again, to go back how we started the interview, we need to be using the language of class and of worker solidarity, and not the language of identity, and not the woke language.
Right.
Because the woke language says to poor whites who support Trump, oh, you're the enemy, you're racist. They might have confused ideas in their minds, but that's not the point. Let's identify that we share the exact same material interests. We have the same social conditions. We have the same bleak future. Right? So the language of class, the language of working class struggle is what we need. And it's starting. You know, it's starting. The trade unions are becoming, there's only 15% of the workforce is unionized.
Yeah.
But the base of that union, they're starting to come alive. We've seen this in the last few weeks.
So what's going to be their counterplay? This is a chess game, honestly.
Well, the union leaders want to take us back to the Democratic Party, and that's a dead end.
That's their chess move.
But the base doesn't have a full political class consciousness, but the base is already saying, don't touch my Social Security. Don't fire me as a public, as a civil servant, right? Don't get rid of our democracy. So there's this awakening beyond those of us on the left.
The Joe Rogan is like the venue of the elites to try and normalize billionaires, as people have joked about. But he's also done roles in pushing anti-war and anti-imperialist agendas as well. But he had Elon Musk on his show, and Elon Musk was trying to convince the Joe Rogan audience that Social Security is a Ponzi scheme when you really think about it. It failed miserably, but I know what they were trying to do. They were using this massive platform of Joe Rogan, who is the most popular man on the planet statistically,
right,
and having this billionaire to try and get us to buy that bullshit,
exactly,
thinking that it would work. And what you think Americans sitting at home would be like, oh yeah, no, I think about it. Socialism is kind of a scam. I don't need it. Nobody's that fucking stupid. But
exactly,
they tried to play that chess move, and it failed. And these failed chess moves by the elites is going to backfire and give us more leverage with the people who are now suddenly waking up to the fact that maybe Elon Musk is an asshole, is just going to fuck us all over, in layman's terms.
Exactly. Exactly. All of the conditions are here for an awakening of class consciousness and working class organization, right? And that's the crossroads we are at right now. The fascist project has not yet consolidated. It faces these contradictions that we've identified. And on the other hand, the working class is awakening and coming alive. And we also need to be very careful not to let the use of scapegoats kick in. That's also why the war on immigrants there's so much at stake for the ruling class with regard to the war on immigrants. Because again, first of all, it's an attack on all workers. And by the way, if you look at who has been high profile arrested, these are immigrant workers who are unionized. This is the New York Times hasn't covered this. CNN has not covered this. But when you look at for instance, the one, Garcia is his last name. He's in El Salvador right now. He belongs to a union.
Interesting.
Yes. The farm worker in the state of Washington, he was a union organizer.
Interesting.
Right. So it's an attack. And also, what is the most unionized sector of the working class are civil servants, public employees. Right. And they're all, 200,000 of them have been laid off. 200,000 union members laid off. Okay, so what I'm getting at is it's careful at this key moment where we can have a working class fight back that sparks class consciousness. We also need to be very careful that we don't let the ruling groups at this point manipulate us with this different type of discourse, and including the war on immigrants and the rhetoric and the lies that go along with that.
It's the biggest challenge we have right now is this is top priority for me, has always been since Trump got elected in 2016, is that this anti-immigration shit, no matter what political spectrum you're on, you have to understand it is a diversion away from immigrants are not the reason why you can't afford a home. But there are people out there who believe that. They believe that they can't afford a home because they think that immigrants are buying it up. And I'm like, who bought 40% of residential properties? It was Blackstone.
Exactly.
It wasn't immigrants. So, and I saw this great meme. It said it was
corporate landlords.
It was a banker who was harboring all the cookies, and there's one cookie left, and he tells the white guy, a white American, hey, watch out for that immigrant. He might steal your cookie while he's hoarding all the cookies. It was such a visceral, simple example that I hope went viral, but
yes.
Yeah.
And to follow up on that, that's why I said earlier in the interview, it's hard for some people to accept this, but nationalism is the nationalist ideology is our enemy. I show a cartoon to my students when we're talking about the link between the immigrant justice struggle and the struggle of all working people and poor people. And the picture is there's this rich guy in the center and there's these tiny little people, poor workers here, and they're saying, looking up at him and ready to fight him and saying, why do you have all the wealth and we have nothing, right? And then this big giant capitalist picks up a stick, draws a line in the sand, and puts on the line the border, right? And then the next scene, because there's 1, 2, and 3 in the cartoon. The next scene, all of the little people start turning towards the border and say, yeah, keep the immigrants out. Yeah, up USA. So that's the role of this patriotism and this nationalism. We identify with being this. That's why we started the interview with citizens of the same country. It's the same metaphor as this cookie.
And glad you touched on patriotism. I'm trying to normalize redefining that term. You're not going to defeat the concept of patriotism with Americans. Like, you're not going to do it overnight. No one's going to get a college education on this type of stuff that you lay out overnight. So we need to co-opt patriotism. On the left, we need to co-opt. We are here in this situation right now because they boiled the frog slowly. We being the frog. Our rights, our liberties, everything has been because they slowly boiled the frog. Who says that we cannot do the same? Why can't the left do the same when it comes to boiling the frog? We can boil their frog. And I've suggested this as a loving piece of advice for the left, is that co-opt the same concepts that they have used to capture the right-wing working class. Co-opt the term patriotism. What does patriotism mean? You love the territory, the land, like a Native American would love his land, and the people within that land. Okay, let's co-opt that. Do you love this land? Do you want what's best for it? Then why do you want Trump to privatize hundreds of thousands of hectare-acres of beautiful natural landscape of trees so that some fucking multinational corporation that has Saudi investors, Chinese investors, Russian investors in it, you're not getting that money from that lumber. That timber, that money the profits that come from that timber will not be going to you. So why do you want to get rid of it? So there's your land-based patriotism, the people inside, the immigrants, the undocumented immigrants. Even though they're undocumented, they're still benefiting you. The reason why you eat, the reason why you have food on the table is because an immigrant picked it.
Exactly.
The reason why we have such what little robustness we have in our economy is because of the undocumented immigrants. Why would you want to get rid of that? So if we co-opt that concept of patriotism and define it ourselves and saying it's the love of the land and love of the people, our neighbors who live next door, regardless of status, regardless of color, whatever, that's patriotism. And let's divorce patriotism from nationalism so that we can bring on board the Americans who will never give up their patriotism, ever, bring them on board and let nationalism be a bastard child who has no parents and has no home. That's one of my solutions I offer to the left as just a workshopping thing. So anyways, just want to get that out there.
Yeah, I think that's very important what you're saying. And it's important to separate patriotism and whatever that will mean to people from nationalism.
Whatever it means to people.
Right. And I think also the language of class, I mean, that will unravel. Once we use that language, things start becoming self-evident. Right? Yes. When we start identifying with one another based on the fact that we're workers facing a precarious future and we're poor and we owe everything we own we owe to the bank, and we start thinking in those terms, other things fall in place.
People will feel it. Problem with activism in leftist spaces is that we want to be ideologically pure, and we're more concerned about our ideology and having that purity and signaling to our fellows in the echo chamber look how ideologically pure you are, when we're not focusing on the material conditions of the people who are not within our ideological bubble.
Right. Which means you're not really on the left.
It means you're just there for the brand of it. It's not.
You're there for the brand. Exactly.
So for the layman who knows nothing about Sandinistas, which I've spoken to a lot of people who are very educated people on the left who actually don't know a lot about the Sandinistas. Can you explain to your average American who they were, why it's important, and why they should care about the Sandinistas and what their legacy represents?
Sure. And let me just start by clarifying that the person who was the president of Nicaragua in the 1980s during the Sandinista revolution has once again returned to the presidency. And today, what's going on in Nicaragua and the people that call themselves Sandinistas really they've betrayed the revolution. They have nothing to do with the revolution of the 1980s. So during the 20th century, for much of the 20th century, the United States, of course, became the dominant world power, but was also the hegemonic power over Latin America since the late 1800s, since 1898, when the U.S. invades Cuba and Puerto Rico and becomes the dominant power. And the U.S. backed dictatorships throughout Latin America and throughout the world as the preferred mechanism of controlling resources around the world, resources and peoples. The United States backed the Somoza dictatorship, brought the Somoza dictatorship to power in the early 1930s, kept it in power with military and political and economic assistance. And so in the 1960s and 1970s, a group called the Sandinista National Liberation Front was formed. It took its name from Augusto Sandino, Cesar Sandino, who had organized a ragtag guerrilla army to fight the Marines. The Marines invaded Nicaragua in the 1920s and occupied the country for some 12 years. And so Sandino fought against the Marines. After the Marines left, they installed the Somoza dictatorship. The dictatorship assassinated Sandino. The 1960s, the Sandinista National Liberation Front is formed, taking that name from Sandino. And you can edit this down. I'm going into a lot of detail.
That's good.
But what the Sandinista revolution represented was something that was going on all around the world in the 20th century, which were, first of all, anti-colonial movements, national liberation movements to overthrow either colonial regimes or dictatorships and authoritarian regimes that had been put into power or defended by the West, by the former colonial powers. So the Sandinistas lead a mass insurrection against the Somoza dictatorship in the late 1970s. So it's a mass uprising. It's a popular revolution. It overthrows the Somoza dictatorship, and they take power in 1979 and attempt during the 1980s to create an alternative political, social, and economic system, a popular democracy, and to orient the country's resources towards meeting the needs of this just incredibly impoverished majority of workers and peasants. And that experiment in revolutionary social change in favor of the poor majority, and through democratic means, there were elections. That was a very dangerous experiment for the United States, for the powers that be in the world capitalist system. So the U.S. organized an armed counter-revolution. And eventually, to make a long story short, the armed counter-revolution was successful in destroying the possibility of a popular revolutionary transformation in Nicaragua. The Sandinista revolution was defeated in 1990. The revolution was defeated, unfortunately. So its legacy, the attempt at revolution led by the Sandinistas in the late 20th century was sort of a symbol of the struggles all around the world during the 20th century against colonialism, against neocolonialism, and against imperialism. It was a struggle that failed because global capitalism triumphed in the late 20th century. That's another story for another time. And so we can take inspiration from that revolution, but we have to recognize that part of the reason that that revolution failed and that the national liberation struggles of the 20th century failed is because capitalism morphed into something more powerful through globalization, through the rise of a transnational capitalist class. That's part of the story. The other part of the story here is that we had a model of revolution in the 20th century. And we have to come to terms with the fact that that model for revolution was flawed, that it failed us, that if we want to build a global left, a global revolutionary movement, a model of revolution in the 21st century, which we desperately need. And by the way, revolution simply means fundamental change.
Yeah.
So obviously the world we live in needs fundamental change. We need revolution. And we need revolution in favor of that 90%, which is the global working class.
Yes.
But we have to recognize that we need new models, new ways of both fighting, new models for how we fight for transforming the world, and then new models for what type of world we want to create.
Dialectics.
Well, dialectics, yes, but the old models in the 20th century, and this is very harsh. Now, I'm going to get critiqued by a lot of people on the left, but the model we had in the 20th century was you have a revolutionary party. It's organized on Leninist vertical. You have a party which is vertical, tells social movements what to do, takes state power, and tries to transform power from above.
Right.
That's what happened with the Soviet Revolution, which we all should have supported if we were living in the 1920s.
Right.
That's what happened in China, and China is now a capitalist country. Soviet Union is now Russia, capitalist country. Right. That's what happens in many parts of the world. This model of a single revolutionary vanguard party controlled from all the way on the top, vertically top down, authoritarian in the way it's organized, patriarchal also in the way it's organized.
Right.
That model, we had a lot of efforts in the 20th century, but that model ultimately failed, and the model won't work in the 21st century. You're an anarchist. We had an experiment. We had the Spanish Civil War was a time when Marxists and socialists came together with anarchists. And it was a breath of fresh air. Of course, the Spanish Civil War, which was 1936 to 1939, the fascists won. Franco won. And it ushered in 4 decades, over 4 decades of dictatorship.
Yeah.
But we had a model, a very different model of revolutionary struggle in which anarchists had an influence. So we brought together Marxist socialists, revolutionary socialists with anarchists. And so we need to think of a different model in which, yes, we need revolutionary political organizations. We absolutely need them. Call them parties or whatever you want, right? That can unite all the different sectors around a project of emancipation, a project of transformation. But we also need mass social movements from below that are not controlled by a political party from above.
Yeah.
We need feminist movements and women's movements. We need indigenous movements. We need community movements. We need student movements. We need working class movements. We need peasant movements in agrarian countries. We need all of these independent, autonomous movements from below to create autonomous space and fight against capital and against oppression in these spaces. We need that, not controlled by a political party from above. So what's the model? We don't have a model. But we need political parties that can unite all of these struggles without controlling them.
And you touched on something great. As you pointed out, I'm an anarchist. And you're not, but you're not an anti-anarchist. I'm not a statist, but I'm not an anti-socialist. So what's so important about us having this dialogue is that we're normalizing different, I guess, subsets of revolution and having these discussions to form a synthesis of something. And obviously, like you said, people on the left might not like what you're saying, but that's why we got to start normalizing these discussions so that they won't be upset with what you're saying. So even if they disagree with what you're saying, they can hear out the practicality behind what you're saying, that it's coming from a place of solidarity with them. It's coming from a place of solidarity against capitalism and against the exploitation of the working class. Right. Still there. It's just another facet of this discussion that needs to be had that's invaluable.
Right. Because anarchists and socialists, we want the same thing. We want the same outcome.
Absolutely.
We want a society based on human freedom in which both our collective labor and the resources of our planet, we're using it for equality and realization of our potential.
Yeah.
Right? Egalitarianism. We want the same outcome. We just have different views, or we're debating different ways of how we get to that outcome.
Exactly. That's what I always say. Is that like the pointless division behind this is like we want the same outcome. It's just a disagreement on how we get there. And we're gonna, like you said, we don't have that. We don't know what that is.
Right.
Because we're facing advanced technologies that are completely monopolized by our enemy. So how do we know what the struggle against that is going to look like? The sky's the limit. Any random one of us in this movement could have a solution. That's why we have to expand out the conversation.
Exactly.
And bring them in.
Exactly. And we know what model we know what methods of getting there that we didn't work, which was the 20th century. So that's the importance of the lessons of the 20th century. We look at our parents, our grandparents, who struggled and participated in these projects in the 20th century. We appreciate and learn from their lessons and also from their defeats. And hopefully we can learn those lessons for the 21st century. How we get to where we're going, we're trying to work out. But we know what didn't work in the 20th century.
And we're not saying that there wasn't other factors that may have influenced it through Western propaganda and obviously the sabotage from capitalists. Capitalists always have a strategy of infiltrating a system that's actually starting to work. They'll do outside pressure, inside pressure, whatever, and then there's mismanagement that happens, all that stuff. But we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're taking what did work and things that did not work out of these historical lessons and figuring out.
Exactly. No, we know these projects failed because there was a combination of imperialism and intervention, and we know all of that, and counter-revolution. Mm-hmm. That combined with the mistakes and the failings of those projects themselves. And the two of them combined is what led to the defeat of the 20th century revolutions.
Back to the Sandinistas. What did work? During its heyday, what was it that gave it its magic to work? Because they were up against a lot. They're up against the American war machine.
There's the Sandinista leadership, but the masses woke up. And when I arrived, I participated in the revolution, and in the early years, because the counter-revolution really starts, Reagan won the elections in 1980, takes power in 1981. But the counter-revolution really gets underway in 1983. That's when the U.S. starts to arm the former dictatorial army, the Somocistas. And so everything deteriorates from there. But from 1979 until 1983, there's this mass ferment from below. Everyone is politically awakened. Everyone feels empowered. Communities are organizing themselves. Everyone's joining mass organizations. Whether you call that socialism, radicalism, doesn't matter. You and I would feel like we were in exactly where we wanted to be, right? And there is all of this hope for the future. And the early social programs, immediately healthcare, massive resources poured into healthcare, clinics and hospitals were built. Immediately education is free and available to everyone. A literacy campaign was carried out in 1980, which reduced illiteracy from approximately 79% to like 14%, something like that. Don't quote me on the exact numbers. The United Nations gave Nicaragua a prize. And UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Social and Cultural Organization, awarded Nicaragua for its literacy campaign. So there's these tremendous social gains. Workers were allowed to unionize. Peasants were encouraged to form peasants' associations. This was also helpful in the early 1980s. But almost immediately, this is why the defeats that we on the left or the worldwide liberation forces suffered in the 20th century has to be seen as our own mistakes were exploited by imperialism and the capitalists. So all of that comes to a very quick end because right away we face the U.S. counter-revolution. So in a counter-revolutionary army, we face an economic boycott, an economic embargo, diplomatic isolation, unbelievable aggression from the United States.
As a result of that and the economic hardships that came along with that, that was their proof to the American citizens, hey, this is why socialism doesn't work. Look how they're suffering. The sanctions,
well, that's of course is the threat. Nicaragua was a threat of a good example.
Exactly.
A threat of a tiny country that can turn things around and improve things for the vast majority. And that was a threat which is very subversive to dictatorships and capitalist systems all over the world. And so that had to be crushed. That threat of a good example. And that's not new. The idea that if someone tries to create a socialist transformation, you destroy that possibility, and then you say, look how miserable and how pathetic they are.
Yeah.
But that's certainly not new. It's the same thing with the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution happens in the end of 1917, and at the close of World War I in 1919, I think there were 17 different Western armies invade. It was called the White Terror, the White Counter-Revolution. The entire the Bolsheviks, I mean, and many people listening to this podcast will, from the left will know this history.
Yeah.
The Bolshevik Party, the Lenin's party was a party of workers, and there were several million workers, and they were the most advanced working class in the world in terms of their working class consciousness and commitment to that workers' revolution, to the Bolshevik Revolution. And they defended that revolution from the White Terror, from the counter-revolution. And they were devastated. The Bolshevik, the Soviet working class, the Russian working class was basically destroyed in those few years of counter-revolution.
Can you tell me what was the most effective strategy of the White Terror that caused the most devastation?
In that case, it was simply outright military destruction. Right. The workers all needed to pick up arms. The country had to move on to what's called, but I don't want to forget the weakness of the project itself. But the country had to move into what Lenin called war communism, meaning you had to take all of squeeze the little resources that were still available in the midst of war, and at the end of World War I, leaving the country in devastation. What little resources were left had to go to military defense.
Yeah.
And so you eventually win militarily. The White Terror, that counter-revolution was defeated, but you're left in such utter ruins with, again, the working class was virtually destroyed, murdered, killed, defending. So the similar thing happened in Nicaragua. But here, the same thing happened in Nicaragua, that suddenly from late 1982 right up until the 1990s, till the revolution's defeated, you had all of the resources of the country had to go to military defense. At one point, because I was a journalist I was both an advisor to the foreign ministry, and I was also the journalist with the Nicaragua news agency, the national news agency, and I was covering the economic side. And so I think the figure was 40%. 40% of the country's wealth, of the GDP, had to go to defense. I mean, an unheard of amount, right? Yeah. 40%. So this devastates any possibility of bringing about positive social change and material improvement for the people in Nicaragua, right? And so, you destroy the ability to say that, yes, anti-capitalist revolution brings benefit, and then you say, see, it's worthless.
Yeah, because they have to mobilize every weapon they have against it to prevent it from sprouting even further, so that the apple doesn't look appealing to Westerners.
Yes, and remember that people struggle against a system and for social change because they want an improvement in their material existence. They don't struggle for abstract ideas. Maybe you and I on the left do for abstract anarchist and socialist ideas, but masses of people, including right now where we want to organize them, they struggle for material improvement, to have a decent standard of living, to be able to get a house, to be able to not be homeless, to be able to not be food insecure. And when you undermine the ability of a revolution to do that, you've destroyed the revolution.
And just for the right-wingers who might be watching this, which I hope they do, for the sake of an olive branch, can you explain to them that the aggression towards the Sandinistas was not just a Republican thing, that the Democratic Party is just as equally involved in this, with the rhetoric that comes from Elon Musk on Twitter and Donald Trump and Fox News? They're trying to brainwash America, or the right-wing working class, into thinking that, see, this is the far left Democrats who, this is their agenda. It's like, you understand that the Democrats and the Republican Party were equally against Nicaragua because it threatened them as a monolith.
100%, yeah. If they're listening, number one, you and I are not enemies in what we really want.
We both, look, for the record, we hate the Democrats, and we hate
passionately. Look, honestly, I would obviously I don't want the Republicans in power, but I'd rather have a conservative Republican who just honestly tells you what he or she wants than a duplicitous Democrat that wants the same thing as the Republican but uses woke language.
Exactly. Dude, it's better if you have a bottle in front of you that's labeled poison than to have a beautiful cup of tea that has a little bit of cyanide in it.
Exactly.
And you're drinking it.
Exactly. It's good cop, bad cop. They're both going to try and mess you up.
Yeah.
The Democrats is a party of the transnational capitalist class. The Democrats is a party against poor people and against workers. They just have a slightly different strategy for how you maintain the domination of the ruling elite, of the political and economic elite.
Talking about solutions. about time we get there. You mentioned that they have not consolidated yet. This fascist conglomerate of the transnational capitalist class and its teeth, I guess that's a good word, the teeth, that its jaws are about to close on us. But it's not quite there. We still have time. What do we do in this time that prevents it further from consolidating?
Right. Yeah. And of course, it's the most important question we can possibly ask. What do we do from here? So, first of all, anyone that's in any position to unionize should be trying to unionize, because all a union means is that working people that share the same interests get together and unite their efforts. Right. So, first of all, everyone should be unionizing. Students should be unionizing. Anyone and everyone should be unionizing. Secondly, we should all be joining organizations. We don't do anything individually. Individually, no one has any power individually. We only have power when we get together with those that share common interests. Right. And third, and here is where, in some senses, I have to think this through, so I'm thinking out loud here. But in some senses, Trumpism has helped us by calling out wokeism. Because wokeism sounds progressive. It sounds like you're in interests of poor black people, of poor indigenous people, of poor immigrants, of women. Now I'm distinguishing wokeism from recognizing that the entire working class is exploited. And within that exploited working class, there are different forms of oppression. Okay. Racism is real. Okay. The oppression of women is real. That is all real. So that's different, recognizing that and combining that with class struggle, with organizing the working class and also fighting these different forms of oppression, right, that we face. That's all real. Wokeism is something different. Right. It's what we critiqued earlier, this identity politics.
Yes.
And the identity politics is anti-working class, anti-class language. We reject the concept of class, reject the category of class, reject class struggle. Yeah. So it's good that we are moving beyond this identitarianism. And if the Republicans use outright racism, the Democrats use identitarian politics and wokeism for the same purposes.
It's the ballet. They play on each other. It goes back to kind of like my hot take on DEI. While DEI sounds great, diversity, equity, and inclusion, in my opinion, it was a shiny object of controversy that BlackRock put in the conversation, in the rhetoric, to basically get people on the right and the left fighting over it. When in fact, all DEI does, it just means that, hey, you might have diversity at Raytheon while you're designing bombs that kill kids in third world countries. So great, you might have a gay Mexican working in the design department that makes a missile, or works at a real estate corporation that is gobbling up real estate and private equity. Great, you have diversity, equity, and inclusion in a large corporation that's fucking over the working class. But it's a great shiny object to fight over. Meanwhile, the whole problem is the fact that you have a corporation that's even doing that.
Exactly. Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and I will add something to it. DEI, in addition, simply opened up space for the professional and the managerial elite among blacks, among Latinos, among women. DEI, if you're working in an Amazon warehouse on the floor, working these massive shifts and these horrible working conditions, DEI isn't helping anyone. You're all just poor exploited workers.
Right.
I mean, DEI is for professors. And I have, by the way, there is an underrepresentation of black and Latino professors relative to white professors. For instance, it might be changing, an underrepresentation of doctors that get medical degrees and go into the medical profession, an underrepresentation of people that are not white, and that underrepresentation is an injustice. And I always supported affirmative action, but with the recognition that this is something that benefits professional and managerial strata. DEI is meaningless if you're just a minimum wage worker in an Amazon warehouse.
Yeah, right.
If you're on a construction site, what DEI doesn't mean anything for you.
Right.
If you're unemployed, it doesn't mean anything for you. If you're a black homeless man in the streets in Los Angeles, DEI is not for you. It has nothing to do with you. So DEI was always, although I supported, not DEI. Okay, take that wording away.
Yeah.
Supported affirmative action, meaning you have to open up the doors of these different professions and these different categories to everyone.
Yeah.
And make sure there's equitable access.
Right.
Okay. But you always have to be clear that this, what they then started calling DEI, was for the elite, the upwardly mobile elite among black and Latinos, to open up space for them.
Yeah.
Not for the majority of non-white working class.
Yeah, just like Fred Hampton said, I'm not going to combat white capitalism with black capitalism. I'm going to combat capitalism with socialism.
Exactly.
In this, everything that we're kind of talking about goes along the lines of why the Black Panthers were so successful and why they were the greatest threat at their time period, was because they were starting to bring in the concept of class struggle across these lines to get people to stop being distracted by this racial shit.
And especially Fred Hampton.
Yes.
Especially, this is why he had to be assassinated.
Yes.
He's very clear. What Fred Hampton did is what we have to do right now. Fred Hampton went to these white communities in Chicago, poor white workers who had the Confederate flag.
Yeah.
Right? And he said to them, he started organizing them, and he had them saying, yes, we're revolutionaries. So the thing is, what did the ruling class have to do? The ruling classes saw mass rebellion in the 1960s and early 1970s. With all its problems, it was an era of mass rebellion, of revolutionary potential. And so the ruling classes said we have to do two things. First, we have to smash it with FBI COINTEMPROL, with assassinations, with mass repression. Okay. Secondly, the ruling class said we have to go global. We have to deindustrialize and weaken the working class in the United States by going global. That's where globalization enters.
Yeah.
And third, we have to co-opt this leadership and a layer of black and Latino and poor people fighting us, and we have to bring them into the professional, managerial, and elite strata.
And what that did was it basically turned class struggle into more like a football game, where if with your Latino, you're cheering on the Latino capitalists, the Latin exceptionalism, and the black people cheering on the black capitalists, and the whites cheering on Elon Musk and Donald Trump. Everybody's picking their team in the football game of capitalism, and meanwhile, everybody in the crowd, which is the majority of the people who attend a football game, besides the players, are all getting fucked.
Right. It's a structure, it's a struggle for equal representation and equal participation in the structures of power, oppression, and exploitation. Absolutely. The problem is unequal representation in these structures for identity politics, not the exploitation and oppression in itself.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so
one of the lessons of the Sandinista revolution that you were asking me about is it's not possible today to have a successful revolution in a small country, even in a big country. I mean, if tomorrow there was a revolution in Guatemala, in Colombia, a socialist revolution, it would be crushed by the global capitalist system.
Right. Going back to what you're talking about, what you just said, about if a small nation were to, have a revolution, a genuine one that's like this, what the Sandinistas did. We're seeing one example of that. But like you said, the global capitalist system will just aim all of its guns towards that, to the point where it's just strategically impossible.
Right.
So right now, I'm sure you've been tracking the latest updates in Burkina Faso, with Ibrahim Traore. They're aiming all their guns at Burkina Faso right now. The Pentagon is starting to signal that it is going to turn its aggression towards Burkina Faso. I believe that even Saudi Arabia is trying to use a very sly tactic to get in. They offered the leader of Burkina Faso, Traore, that, hey, we'll build a bunch of mosques in there. I know that that's a Trojan horse, no doubt, and he knew that.
Right.
But despite the fact that they're turning their weapons towards him and they're starting to turn their guns, which they will be outmatched, he's inspiring revolutionaries within the countries that are turning their guns on Burkina Faso. And that is where the true magic is happening with what Burkina Faso is doing. I don't know. Is my analysis off on that, Professor? I'm just curious.
No. So I've only studied the headlines. I mean, I've followed what's going on in those countries, and they're very positive. The developments are very hopeful, and they're very positive. But let's take this story back to Lenin and Trotsky. Both of them argued, and for that Marx argued, for that matter, that you can have a successful revolution at the moment of revolution in one country, but unless it spreads to other countries and continues to spread throughout other countries, it will fail.
Yes.
Both Lenin and Trotsky said that. Trotsky called it the permanent revolution, that you constantly need to expand it out of an individual country.
Yes.
You can't have socialism or revolution in just one country. Lenin used his own words, but said basically the same thing. So these developments that are taking place in the Sahel, they're very positive from the little that I know. But the hope is that spreads.
Yeah.
That spreads throughout other countries, and it's something that grows outward and outward.
Yeah.
If it stays within that little individual region, it will be crushed.
Yes.
By the global capitalist system, by the powers that be.
It has to become a virus, and
it has to be.
I tell people this, that revolution, the true power of revolution is not in its hard power. Ultimately, it's in the fact that it's a cultural virus, because you cannot fight a virus once it starts spreading through the population.
Right.
It has to transform into something that's contagious. Let's just say that Burkina Faso is successful and it somehow is able to withstand imperialist aggression and it survives. Great. What does that do for the rest of us? It has to become a virus. It has to transform into a contagious thing, because at that point, then that virus will turn into hard power, because then the empire and the imperialist forces and the elites will not have any human fodder to use to enforce its hegemony, right? So that's why people have all their eyes glued on Burkina Faso, and that's great, because we're also starting to plant the seeds in our own countries. Hey, maybe we should be doing the same thing. And then it spreads that way. Going back to solutions, you mentioned unionizing as one of them. Given the success of the Black Panthers, and it ultimately getting disrupted by COINTELPRO, the lessons we learn out of that, of what the Black Panthers, the downfall of them as a result of the government aggression towards it, is that it's centralized. Whenever you centralize, or whenever you have any type of leadership, you just spray painted a big bullseye on you, and you just told the government, hey, assassinate here.
Right. Yeah. But so let me go back to what we were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
I am a Marxist.
Yeah.
But I don't consider myself a Leninist. Now, I have tremendous respect for Lenin. I've learned tremendous things from reading Lenin. I used to consider myself a Leninist. But the Leninist form of organizing is a vanguard party, a centralized vanguard party. There's a central committee all the way on the top, makes decisions, goes down through the entire party, but not just the party. And then there's social movements, and the different social movements need to follow what the party says. That was the 20th century model. I critique it as vanguardism. Now, Leninism is not Lenin. I think if Lenin were, Marx once said, I am not a Marxist. I don't know if you've heard that.
Right.
That when he was near his death, he was becoming extremely famous, and people all around were doing things in the name, calling themselves Marxists and saying they're doing things in the name of what Marx said. And Marx famously said, I am not a Marxist. Meaning, don't turn what I said into some dogma and, speak. So I think if Lenin were alive, he would look at what Leninist parties in the 20th century claimed and did, and said, I am not a Leninist. So I, William Robinson, am not a Leninist. And I think that vanguard model, that's why I said earlier, we need political parties, powerful political organizations that can take all of the different struggles we're involved in and show how they're all connected to the larger global capitalist system, and why ultimately we need to overthrow capitalism if we want all these different struggles and all these different sectoral struggles to be successful. So we need these powerful political organizations, but not organizations that dominate the social movements. Down here below, we need autonomous democratic spaces.
It's merely another front in the battle. Like, whereas we have grassroots community organizing at, say, your local neighborhood, getting to know your neighbors, that's like on a micro level. So we have to look at this as multiple facets of one big struggle, basically, right? Like, is that what you're kind of saying?
Yes, and that the different struggles have their own autonomy. I mean, typically well, look at the China. Okay, China is now a capitalist, but even when it was not capitalist, if you go back to the Maoist era, you have a communist party, you have a women's organization. The women's organization is not independent of the Communist Party. If women want to fight against patriarchal oppression and for their specific agenda, they're told by the Communist Party, no. The only women's organization you can have is the one linked to the Communist Party. The trade unions. The trade unions, even, again, right now it's a capitalist country, only with a Communist Party calling itself communist. But the trade unions, if workers wanted to independently organize as workers, they were told, no, you can only participate in and belong to the unions which we as a Communist Party control. Okay. So every single sector was like that. That is the model which I am rejecting. And so I said I will not be popular among people that call themselves on the left today. Okay.
Hopefully that's not the case, because I believe this, and if it is the case, I hope that this is a stepping stone into not being offended by this stuff. This is the like, I'm an anarchist. I don't even believe in states. Right. I have my own strategic viewpoints on how things should be done, but I'm not anti-you and what you're saying. I do believe in intercommunalism, but it doesn't mean I'm anti your critique of it. This is the stuff that we need to normalize, guys. These conversations need to be commonplace in this revolution.
Exactly. Sectarianism is toxic and dangerous.
Absolutely.
And at a moment when fascism is trying to, as you put it, clamp down its jaw, close that jaw and consolidate. The last thing we need is sectarianism among those that should be allies and struggling shoulder to shoulder. And I actually share your critique of the state. I just have there's some mild differences here, which we don't need to get into now. But the thing is, states are not neutral arenas. Every state in the world right now is a capitalist state.
Absolutely.
It is a state of the capitalist system. So if we're a leftist party, we don't want to simply take over the capitalist state and administer it.
Yes.
And we want to smash the capitalist state.
Yes.
Right. So, of course, we have to tactically and sometimes strategically participate in electoral processes, try and take public office, but in order to, from that public office, try and dismantle state power.
Right.
Capitalist power in the state.
Absolutely.
Not embrace it. So that's the other problem in the left. If you have, and this was the lesson of Nicaragua, and it's also the lesson of Venezuela. Venezuela attempted to make a revolution early this century. So you have a party. The party struggles through elections, a radical party, a revolutionary party.
Yeah.
You're administering a capitalist state. You're overseeing an economy which is a capitalist economy. Either you very rapidly transform that an anti-capitalist, or the logic of occupying a capitalist state means you have to repress those below. You have to reproduce the capitalist system in your territory.
Right.
Okay, this is a little bit abstract. And if I were the head of a revolutionary party in a small country, and I was elected president, my only legitimate role as a revolutionary in that position as president is not to control the social movements from below. Not to tell the social movements from below, support me because I'm here in the capitalist state. Is to tell the social movements, do everything you can to overthrow me. Do everything you can to resist anything I impose on you which is against your interests.
Right.
So we don't have a strategy for how you fight at the national level, how you try and overthrow the capitalist state. We don't have a strategy for that, and we're feeling our way. But one thing is clear, the statist vanguardist model of the 20th century is bankrupt. And to go back to what you were saying, we need the political organizations, but to never control the autonomous movements from below. Really, it needs to be a project from bottom up, not from top down.
Mm-hmm. 100%. I'll leave it off on this last small section. For people who aren't in any capacity to form a union or to be politically active on a state level or local government level, let's start from the bottom. Starting from the person who's just living in his house in a neighborhood who wants to start doing something. What should they do from the bottom level?
Yeah. First of all, local power, local community power. Organize at any level that you're at.
Right.
But so we have to reconceive what we mean by unions, which I'll get to in just a moment.
Okay, yeah.
But first, so I'm involved. I wish I could say that I was leading in my community. I'm not. I'm not organized in my own community. I mean, in Los Angeles. But I am involved throughout Latin America with organizations that are taking a very different approach to organizing, and which see this local autonomous struggles, wherever it is, your level of community, your indigenous community, your workplace community, whatever it is, all of this local autonomous struggle. So wherever you are, organize. Organize, whether it's for tenants' rights, if you live at tenants' rights, whatever it is, local autonomous organizing. But what I want to say is this is very important before we end the interview.
Right. No.
There is a global working class, some 5 to 6 billion strong. The vast majority of humanity belongs to the global working class. But that working class doesn't necessarily have stable employment. A section of it is surplus humanity, unemployed. Another section of it may be employed with very unstable employment. And then another sector may have more stable employment where you organize a formal union, like postal workers or government workers. So the old concept of unions is the stable workers get organized. And the unstable ones, plus the structurally unemployed surplus humanity, don't organize in a union. We need a new conception of union. If you're a worker, you join a union. A union, even if you're unemployed, you're a member of a union. So that's the...
That's good that you articulated that, because a lot of people think of unions, they think of the daunting legal task of getting a lawyer and getting the paperwork involved.
Right. That's only one little dimension. But the other thing also is the traditional strategy, and this is still relevant, of course, is that the union fights back by withdrawing its labor. You're the capitalist, we're the union. We want to protest, we're going to go on strike and withdraw our labor. So you cannot exploit us during the time we're on strike, you're losing money. And that's our leverage against you. Okay, that's still relevant, that's very relevant, don't get me wrong, very relevant. But if you are not employed, you don't have your labor to withdraw. So there was an experience in Argentina in the early 20th century. Argentina, during its economic crisis at the early 21st century, had a deep economic crisis. Some 40% of the population was suddenly unemployed. And so they formed a movement known as the piqueteros. Basically those that are picketing, those that are striking. And their position was, we can't withdraw our labor from the capitalists because we're not being exploited by the capitalists. We're being marginalized, thrown out. Instead, we're going to disrupt the ability of the capitalist system to function. So they would go from they were called belts of misery, like the miserable ghettos and shanty towns at the outskirts. They'd go down to the center where the stock exchange is, where the rich lived, where the government buildings were, and they would disrupt functioning. They would force the public transportation system to stop. They would force the stock exchange to close. They would force everything to close down, and they would disrupt the functioning of the system. Because when your labor is being exploited, you withdraw your labor. When you're already marginalized, you disrupt the ability of capitalism to function. Something like Occupy Wall Street. They didn't stop Wall Street, but they went down and said, we're going to protest here. So I just want to conclude by saying we need a new conception of unions in which there's multiple forms of union struggle. One is the mass strike where you withdraw your labor. Another one is how do you disrupt the smooth functioning of the capitalist system? How do you unionize, meaning how do you get together with others that change, other workers that are experiencing the same conditions? So I don't have any of the answers.
Right.
But these are the big challenges, the big questions, the big things we need to explore. And in order to move forward, we need to understand global capitalism, how it exists, how it's structured, how it functions in 2025. Some of the interview we got into that. But that means to conclude that part of revolutionary struggle at this point is to study global capitalism as it has been and is being transformed. And that's part of our task.
Yeah.
And that's my role as an organic intellectual, to try and do that analyzing and that theorizing.
Great intellectual at that, and the way you broke it down was outstanding. And I would just want to add, for the sake of the audience, my 2 cents into strategy as well is I've been, if you followed me, I always preach what I term the 4 wins approach. And this is just a very basic micro level of what you can do personally in your community. Look at the 4 directions of the compass around you where you physically are. Get to know your neighbors, who's to the east, the west, the north, and the south. Get to know them. Get to know them personally, get to know their needs, and start strategizing with them, asking them what they need, tell them what you need, and start collectivizing things. Get some food stocks, make sure that they're sufficient for water, food, shelter, medicine, whatever they need. Start to just get to know your 4 neighbors in the 4 directions of the compass, and start there. Then try to inspire the next 4 houses or 4 neighbors next to that. And before you know it, you have an interconnected network within that neighborhood. So it's a micro example, but it's something that you can do right now. It doesn't take a lot of foresight. It just, one of the greatest starts and seeds of revolution is getting to know your neighbors. So that's my 2 cents I'll throw in there. Now, last thing, and this ends on the topic of your book, Global Police State. What you were talking about as far as unionizing and everything like that, the Occupy Wall Street type of example, well, now we have to prepare for what the response will be, which will be the police state, state aggression. How do we mitigate that? How do we prepare ourselves? How do we prepare ourselves for that state martial response?
Yeah. You know, of course I don't have the answer, but I have my ideas. And our power and our safety is in numbers. Mm-hmm. If there are a handful of us who are leading solidarity with Palestine, we're all rounded up. If we're not U.S. citizens, we're deported. We see that right now. Mm-hmm. But the police state cannot repress millions and millions of people.
Yes.
So, again, the key is organize, 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 organize. And just what you said, I mean, I think that was actually beautiful what you said. If you organize at your workplace, if you're at your workplace. You organize on your campus if you're on campus. You organize in your neighborhood if you're in your neighborhood. So all of these different levels of organizing need to also be in solidarity with each other, all these different spaces. And our defense from the police state, besides learning about the police state and besides learning about global capitalism and how it operates, our defense is in our numbers. It's when we're millions strong. The police state is useless. Mm-hmm. The repression that is very effective with the police state is, first of all, when it's selective. You get the key leaders. I mean, like I said, they're doing it right now. It's not arbitrary who is being rounded up and deported. And again, there was an article that came out with actual data. Union members.
Yes.
So the police state is very good at selective repression.
Yes.
Secondly, the police state is very good at using the strategy of instilling fear.
Yes.
And those are 2 things. So we have to overcome our fear. And we have to make resistance massive enough so that selective resistance doesn't do the trick. And no one can be indispensable.
Nobody.
I think you mentioned that. Yeah.
Nobody.
Right.
Exactly. Right. That's so key.
Yes.
Because the second we start doing that, it's a slippery slope. Oh, well, they're dispensable too. And then we start creating the same structure of hierarchy of the people that we're fighting against.
Yes.
Absolutely. I agree. Nobody is indispensable in this movement. I think that's a great cherry on top of the cake. Professor, thank you for blessing my home with your presence. You know, very convenient interview for me in the comfort of my own home. So I'll take it, you know. So
thank you so much for inviting me, for doing the interview, and I hope some of what I said is worthwhile.
All of it is worthwhile, and this is going to be so useful for the audience. It's a great toolkit, you know, quite honestly. Absolutely. Well, Professor, all power to the people.
All power to the people.
All right.
All power to the working class.
All power to the working class. Class warfare. Not identity wars, not religious wars, class war.
Class war, class politics.
Absolutely.